Chapter 336. At this moment, a heated debate was taking place in the arbitration conference. The venue for the arbitration was the great western city's municipal government. This sword formation could fuse sword intent into one's chi and blood. Using blood swords to set up a sword formation, one could freely control lightning, mountains, and lakes within the range of the sword formation. It could almost transform into most of the natural phenomena in the world. It was a set of sword techniques that combined offense and defense into a myriad of variations. The large hall was filled with people from all walks of life who had come to watch. There were aristocrats from the great western region, experts from various factions, and so on. Of course, there were also hundreds of civilians that Sally had invited to witness the outcome of the arbitration. However, Sally continued to hold on. Although her face was pale and her hands were pale, there was no fear in her eyes. She had known about the situation before coming to the Great Western region and also understood that Fang Xingjian, whom she was up against, represented the strongest influence in the Great Western region. However, she had still persevered. Beside them were 6 other swordsmiths invited by the association. Their 6 votes and Sally's 1 vote determined the outcome of the arbitration. Fang Xingjian said casually, "There's no rush. Even if they finish early, they'll have to come back and continue. There's no way they'll lose this arbitration." With a success rate of 31%, Fang Xingjian's luck this time around was quite good. He had finally managed to fuse the aquatic sword formation onto the Thunder Prison Earth Sword. Limitless sword formation level 40. Myriad phenomena inseparable way of the sword. The transformation of heaven and earth, the sun, the moon, and the cosmos are all integrated into the sword formation. In summary, there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. A total of 9 people from the sword arts department have all gone through with it. Other than improving their bodies, there are no signs of their internal organs failing. I myself have also cultivated the rebirth sword technique to level 5. And there are no side effects at all. Right now, Governor Devitt and the Great Western Region's regional chief were both seated at the very front of the spectator stands. Seated on the platform were arbitrator Sally and the additional officials from the Knight Association who had arrived later on as reinforcements. Seeing how the teachers from the Sword Arts Department came up one after another to prove that there was no problem with the rebirth sword technique, Sally's frown deepened. "Oh, is there a problem? Mike and the others have already recounted everything that happened. What do you think is wrong?" Sally asked. However, at this moment, he was truly displaying his aura. Just the fact that his body was continuously exchanging information with the ether particles in the outside world was enough to make one tremble in fear. A teacher couldn't help but stand up and say, "That's the problem with the 3 of them." In his knowledge sea, the 2 skill seeds collided and rubbed against each other violently. A large amount of information kept on fusing and exchanging, finally turning into a brand new skill seed. Sally smiled, as if she had been waiting for this question. She ordered someone to distribute the documents that she had prepared beforehand. Based on the association's latest news, other than Mike and the other 2, there are 5 people from the Northern Ice region, 7 from the Southern Flame region, and 12 from the Eastern Sand region. A total of 40 knights and 64 apprentices have experienced various degrees of deterioration in their internal organs after cultivating the rebirth sword technique. Do you have any explanation for this? As she spoke, she waved her hand and had people distribute the statistical data. What? As expected, there's a problem with this rebirth sword technique. Thankfully, the school requested for my son to learn it, and I got him to reject it. Every gaze, every action, and every word from the other party was like a huge mountain pressing down on her. This was the pure suppression of their auras. Even though they didn't really attack, Sally's face still turned pale, and she saw stars. However, those who were truly capable and had influence could faintly sense a storm brewing under the calm. It was not that she felt that the other party had no flaws, but that she felt an immense pressure. There were a total of 9 conferred knights, including Hops, the team leader, and head of department James, who were level 29. They could kill her several hundred times with just a casual raise of their hands. This immense pressure was something that ordinary people would not be able to understand. We'll still need to carry out further observation and research on them. Moreover, it's been such a long time since the rebirth sword technique was released, and only the 3 of them have met with trouble. Isn't this enough to show that there's a problem? Although he wanted to make use of this opportunity to cultivate the lightless sword as well, today was the day of the arbitration. Feng Xingjian let out a sigh and headed out of the sacred land. Looking at the phenomena sword formation, Feng Xingjian nodded to himself. As long as he could synthesize another set of lightless sword, he would be able to complete the greatest achievement of the Great Western Region Regional Academy's Sword Arts Department, the prodigious demolition sword. Usually, conferred knights who could cultivate the prodigious demolition sword were already qualified to apply for graduation. Feng Xingjian would probably be able to complete this sword technique within 2 months or so. In fact, if it was not because there was no one who could refine the cultivation method for the prodigious demolition sword, allowing Feng Xingjian to cultivate it directly, his rate of improvement would be even faster. With the Holy Orzen's letter and testimony, Feng Xingjian knew that it was impossible for him to lose. This time around, the rebirth sword technique might have been intentionally downplayed by the government, but most commoners, apprentices, and knights knew nothing about it. The most they could get was only one result, whether or not they could cultivate the rebirth sword technique. With that, the head of the sword arts team, Hops, clapped his hands, and his disciple, Leon, handed over many reports. These are the various parameters we've recorded regarding the cultivation of the rebirth sword technique. There aren't any abnormal changes, and it can even be said that everything is getting better. To think that there are 104 people, Hops himself was a level 29 expert in the 2nd tier. As the governor from 2 generations ago, James was a top-notch character in the 2nd tier and was extremely close to becoming an expert in the 1st tier. After 3 consecutive days of wholehearted cultivation, Feng Xingjian finally managed to cultivate the aquatic sword formation to the maximum level of level 40. His ether synchronization rate had also reached 31%. The moment he left the sacred land, he saw Zhou Xingwen looking at him anxiously. Zhou Xingwen shouted, "Why is it taking so long? The arbitration has been going on for almost an hour. If you still don't go, it'll be seen as you've given up." The 2 of them usually kept their auras and information hidden in the academy. Before Feng Xingjian, they appeared to be as harmless as ordinary old men. After Sally revealed this shocking piece of news, the entire audience burst into an uproar. Everyone was astonished by the number of 104 people. Sally looked at the group of people from the Great Western Regional Academy, and her frown deepened. Looking at the conferred knights who had finished their statements, Sally said calmly, "I've heard about your sword theories. However, just because there are no problems with the sword theories doesn't mean that there are no problems with the rebirth sword technique. You guys aren't divine-level experts, nor are you true gods. As long as you're human, there will naturally be flaws and flaws. If there are no problems with the rebirth sword technique, why would Mike and the other 2 have their internal organs deteriorate after cultivating it?" Chapter 337. The rebirth sword technique was merely an experimental sword technique, and there had not been any major powers who had purchased it to learn it on a large scale. To think that over 100 people across the entire country had met with problems, how shocking was this? Seeing the changes, head of department James and team leader Hops frowned. James let out a soft sigh and said, "They're really vicious. 104 people. They're planning on completely suppressing the rebirth sword technique." In the spectator stands, Lilia could not help but frown. Ferdinand consoled her. "It'll be fine, Lilia. These are the 3 strongest people in the Great Western region joining forces. Moreover, the 2nd prince hasn't even made a move yet. Xingjian will be fine." However, the more Ferdinand spoke, the less confident he felt. 104 people had met with problems while cultivating the rebirth sword technique. In order to clear their suspicions, they would have to prove that the problems these 104 people had met with had nothing to do with the rebirth sword technique. How much effort and time would they have to expend? James looked at the letter in his hand. It was the proof from the northern ice region's railings. However, at this moment, there was no longer any meaning in bringing it out. Looking at the many agitated spectators, he knew that it was no longer useful to talk about the sword theory. All the commoners, apprentices, knights, and those whose sword art's realm was not high enough would only remember that 104 people had met with problems while cultivating the rebirth sword technique. As for the sword theory and what the rebirth sword technique was like, why would these weaklings care? They did not have the level to care either. However, Sally was not satisfied with this. This time around, she wanted the rebirth sword technique to suffer a crushing defeat. Therefore, she said once again, these 104 lives are the greatest doubts towards the rebirth sword technique. However, even though you say that there are no problems with the sword theory of the rebirth sword technique, I have two witnesses here who have different opinions. Under everyone's astonished gazes, Sword Saint Sasa walked out slowly. James glared at Sasa and said, "Sasa, do you know what you're doing?" Sasa's face was filled with a confident smile. He had absorbed the fake sword intent from the dragon scale and felt that he already had the hope of attaining the divine level. Right now, the School of Sword Arts, the Myriad Stars Palace, and the First Prince had the upper hand against the Great Western Region. How could he not be confident? After this, I'll leave the Great Western Region and look for a place to analyze the Heaven's Volition sword intent. Those fellows from the School of Sword Arts think that they can use me as a blade, but they don't know that I've obtained the Heaven's Volition sword intent. As long as I fully focus on analyzing the profoundness within it, I'll be able to become another heavenly lord of the Blood Sea in the future. By then, putting aside the School of Sword Arts, even the entire empire might be in my hands. Sasa walked up to the front of the stage, and Sally asked slowly, "Mr. Sasa, tell us what you think of the rebirth sword technique." The rebirth sword technique has a fatal flaw. The reason why he could cause irreversible damage to his internal organs was because of the circulation of his vital energy and blood. He had forcefully combined dozens of powerful sword techniques from all over the place. This kind of low-level method was obviously very problematic. We all know that the blood vessels and nerves in the human body are very weak. Therefore, since ancient times, all the methods to circulate one's vital energy and blood have to be extremely cautious. Even so, each set of methods to circulate one's vital energy and blood still requires a lot of practice before they can be put to good use. Based on what I know, Fang Xingjian's rebirth sword technique has never been tested on humans. Sasa threw a glance at the people from the Great Western Region Regional Academy and said coldly, "However, under such circumstances, this sword technique has been reported to the Knight Association and is held in high regard. It's even said that it's a sword technique that can change society. The person who did this is completely devoid of conscience." A teacher could not help but stand up and scold furiously. "Sasa, you be **starred. You're lying through your teeth? Then did I say anything wrong? Has Fang Xingjian ever conducted any human experiments? There's no need for that at all. The rebirth sword technique is a nurturing sword technique that nurtures the body and accumulates potential. The circulation of vital energy and blood follows the natural flow of the human body. It's just like how the blood in your body flows every day. Would there be internal bleeding and organ failure? However, many people present clearly did not think so. Regardless of whether it was the Sword Saint's name or the simple logic he had spoken of, they all agreed with him. You've never tried it before? To say that there's no problem with the sword theory, but to think that he hasn't even tried it once. I think that Fang Xingjian might not have even picked up his own rebirth sword technique. These people from the regional academy really don't care about anything for the sake of their disciple. There were only a few experts in the audience who did not understand the logic behind sword arts. They could only listen to the words of those who felt that it made sense. Sasa clearly understood what was going on. He did not talk about the rebirth sword technique principles and only brought up the fact that Fang Xingjian had not conducted any large-scale human experiments. Sasa took out a letter and said, "This is a letter written to me by the School of Sword Arts Supreme Chief, Hung Tianxiao." In it, he explains in detail his assessment of the rebirth sword technique. Seeing this, Sally's brows twitched slightly. She looked at the letter together with the other 6 sword arts masters. In the letter, Hung Tianxiao had pointed out the great flaw in the circulation of vital energy and blood in the rebirth sword technique. Although the 6 sword arts masters still had doubts, they could not say anything to rebut. There was no other way. The School of Sword Arts and Hung Tianxiao basically represented the highest level of sword arts in the empire. How could they possibly rebut? Sally read out Hung Tianxiao's letter, and once again, a huge commotion broke out. Sally said coldly, "All right, I believe that everyone has already come to a conclusion. Right now, I still have a letter here from the Myriad Stars Palace's Master Lawrence." James closed his eyes. Lawrence was Holt's master, as well as the disciple of the divine-level expert, the astral ancestor. His appearance represented the astral ancestor's appearance. Hops also let out a breath. At level 29, they were already standing at the peak of Confer Knights. However, when compared to divine-level experts, there was no way they could be compared at all. Although Lawrence was not a divine-level expert, he was a divine-level expert's disciple. This identity amplified the authority of his words by 10 times. Even if they did not lose the arbitration, as long as Lawrence's words were spread out, how many knights would still dare to cultivate the rebirth sword technique? Sally slowly read out Lawrence's letter. The rebirth sword technique is truly a groundbreaking sword technique. However, due to the limitations of the creator's sword arts cultivation, he wasn't able to truly complete this set of sword technique. This caused the sword technique to have a great flaw, causing strong repercussions to the human body's internal organs. However, his creativity is still very valuable as a reference. Our Myriad Stars Palace already has a plan to join forces with the School of Sword Arts and the Ancient Path of Purgatory to create a new sword technique by combining the rebirth sword technique with several tens of nurturing techniques. Chapter 338. Holt, who had personally passed the letter to Sally, let out a sigh and closed his eyes. Norman, who had been by his side, grinned and said, "It's over for Fong Xinjiang." Holt shook his head. "That's right, it's over." However, there was an indescribable disappointment in his tone. After Sally finished reading the letter, she looked at James and the others and asked, "Do you guys have anything else to say?" She looked down at James, Hops, and the others from above, as if she was the one with the stronger abilities. James and Hops frowned, but they were unable to come up with any solution. However, Governor Devitt remained unperturbed, as if he did not mind this scene at all. When a regional chief saw him like this, he could not help but ask, "You're just going to look on?" Devitt waved his hand and said, "It's fine, it's fine." The corners of his lips curled up into a hint of a smile. "Everything is under control." A hint of doubt flashed in the regional chief's eyes. However, at the next moment, he thought of the second prince's intelligence capabilities and thought that Devitt must have something to rely on for saying this. He was curious as to how Devitt was going to turn the tables. That damned Fong Xinjiang. He released this sword technique for everyone to learn? To think that it has fatal side effects. His status as a conferred knight should be revoked. And the Pantheon Monument and the Killing Techniques Palace, he must have cheated as well. Almost everyone on the spectators' stand felt fury and disgust toward the rebirth sword technique and Fong Xinjiang. Lilia and Ferdinand looked at the people who were scolding Fong Xinjiang, and their countenances gradually turned grim. Their eyes were filled with panic. If today's incident were to end like this, then Fong Xinjiang would undoubtedly become a pillar of shame in history, and his name would truly go down in infamy for 10,000 years. James's face trembled a little, and he stood up abruptly. His violent martial will swept through the entire place, as if it was a material attack, instantly suppressing everyone's scolding. Sally looked at Head of Department James coldly and said arrogantly, "Senior James, I know that you're very strong, and it's second transition, level 29. I'm afraid that no one here today will be a match for you. However, even if you can kill everyone here today, you won't be able to change the world's opinion. There's no doubt about the rebirth sword technique. If you guys are unable to prove it, Then get Feng Xingjian to come out and get the creator of the rebirth sword technique to answer our questions. If he is also unable to answer today, I'll exercise the authority that the association has given me and apply for a ban on the dissemination and exchange of the rebirth sword technique, as well as all related experiments within the country. James exhaled, finally understanding the other party's plan. They could prove time and time again that there were no problems with the rebirth sword technique. How many people had managed to successfully cultivate it? However, even if they pulled out 10,000 people, or even 100,000 people, they would not be able to cover up the 100 people who had failed or were about to die. These guys really deserve to die. Thinking of all these, James looked at the empty seat next to Feng Xingjian and felt that it was a good thing that Feng Xingjian had not come today. Sally slapped the table and bellowed, "Feng Xingjian? Is he afraid? Is he ashamed? For his own selfishness, he's letting so many young people and the Empire's future pay for his success and fame. He's a leech that's stuck to the Empire. Such a person isn't fit to be a confer knight." As Sally spoke, she seemed to feel a faint pain on her shoulder. She shouted, "I'll ask one more time. Where's Feng Xingjian? If he still doesn't appear, then according to the rules, I'll treat it as him giving up on this arbitration." When Sword Saint Sasa, who had returned, heard this, the corners of his lips curled up slightly. "It's over for Feng Xingjian." Many people in the spectator stands also shouted, "Revoke Feng Xingjian's status as a conferred knight. Arrest him. Put him on trial. The circulation of the rebirth sword technique must be banned." Sally nodded. Just as she was about to say something, the door opened. Elsewhere, just a few minutes ago, Feng Xingjian and Zhou Xingwen had walked into the main hall of the municipal government. They walked along the wide corridor, and the sound of their footsteps kept ringing out in the spacious corridor. On their way forward, a tall and big silhouette blocked their way. Armstrong, whose face was covered in scars, stood there steadily. He had a smile on his face, and although he was covered in scars, he still gave off a gentle feeling. "Lord Armstrong," Zhou Xingwen said respectfully. "Lord, why have you come out? I've been waiting for you guys." Armstrong said solemnly, "Xingjian, why have you come so late? The situation inside is already very grim." "Oh, the arbitration panel has the upper hand?" Armstrong patted him on the shoulder and asked, "Are you confident? If you can't, you can leave now." "What?" Zhou Xingwen was taken aback. Had the arbitration panel situation become so grim? Feng Xingjian smiled and said, "It's impossible for me to lose." Looking at the confidence in Feng Xingjian's eyes, Armstrong said softly, "Is that so?" As he spoke, an extremely sinister, vicious, and venomous information current slowly darted into Feng Xingjian's brain from his palm. As a level 29 conferred knight, he had personally activated the killing technique, small puppet technique. The attack was so secretive that even the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor was unable to detect it, let alone react to it. The small puppet technique is a secret technique from the ancient path of hell. Those who know about it say that it's the most venomous killing technique in history. A hint of contempt flashed in Armstrong's eyes as he looked at the unresponsive Feng Xingjian. As the First Prince's most secretive clone, he grasped the power of the soul from the 36 Hell's maps. It was also one of the 36 powers of hell. Together with the small puppet technique, he could even slightly affect a level 29 conferred knight, let alone Feng Xingjian. Heaven-shaking Sword Potter, for example, had been controlled by him to the point where he had no control over his own life and death. He was still lying unconscious on the hospital bed. Of course, this killing technique would only be effective if it was continuously performed, and the distance it could be performed was not more than 10 meters. More importantly, it could only be used to control the physical body and was unable to change the heart and memories of the person being controlled. Therefore, it could not be used to assist the First Prince in signing the Hell's maps. Armstrong looked at Feng Xingjian and asked, "Oh, where do you get your confidence from? Tell me, and I'll give you some advice." "There's no need. You know once I go in and tell you." Feng Xingjian took a step forward and was about to go around Armstrong's body when the latter patted him on the shoulder. The small puppet technique was activated, and together with the concealed information current, an extremely mysterious and venomous information current gushed toward Fang Xingjian's consciousness. I think it's better if you tell me now. There seemed to be a strange gleam flashing in Armstrong's eyes, and the words he spoke also contained a mysterious charm. However, Fang Xingjian blinked, looking at him as if he was looking at a fool. Simultaneously, the letter on his chest shone brightly. Armstrong's countenance changed. He wanted to retreat, but he realized that he could no longer move. Chapter 339. Streams of white light gushed out from Fang Xingjian's chest, and Armstrong felt as if there was someone looking at him from within the light. That gaze was like a high mountain, like the ocean, as complicated as the universe, and as heavy as the sun, moon, and stars. This was not a gaze that humans could withstand, and it was a gaze that caused Armstrong to feel despair. When he regained his senses once again, he leaned back abruptly and spurted out a large amount of blood uncontrollably. He seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant, and he fell to the ground. He used both hands to support himself, and only then did he manage to hold himself up. However, very soon, he opened his mouth once again, and fresh blood spurted out incessantly. Very soon, as the blood continued to spurt out, he even started to vomit out some of his internal organs. His body once again aged, and even age spots started to appear on his face. Looking at his shriveled and wrinkled palm in disbelief, Armstrong looked at Fang Xingjian and asked, "What did you do? What was that earlier?" He wanted to attack Fang Xingjian, but he realized that his waves and mental cultivation method were no longer able to circulate. It was as if his brain had been covered with a layer of lard, and he was unable to unleash any extraordinary powers. Fang Xingjian took out the Holy Orzin's letter and thought of what Huang Lin had said. It contained the martial will of a divine-level expert. With just a single thought, they can turn a level 29 conferred knight into this state. It's no wonder that they can change the direction of a country and history. It's true that people like this are no different from gods. At this moment, Fang Xingjian had a new understanding of how terrifying a divine-level expert was. Thankfully, this time around, Fang Xingjian was standing next to him. Thinking of the first 5 levels of the prodigious astral divine powers waves which he had written in his previous letter, Fang Xingjian decided that he would send the remaining 2 levels of the prodigious astral divine powers waves once he returned as a thank you gift. Looking at the letter and the gradually extinguishing white glow, Armstrong spurted out fresh blood as he looked at the letter in astonishment and said, "This? What is this?" "The Holy Orzin wrote a letter to me to prove that there's no problem with my rebirth sword technique." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, a hint of understanding flashed in Armstrong's eyes. So that's how it is. A deity-level expert indeed lives up to his name. He looked at Fang Xingjian, his eyes flashing with a deep sense of jealousy and wariness. What capabilities does this Fang Xingjian have to be able to gain the favor of a deity-level powerhouse? However, when he sensed his current state, traces of fear and despair surged in his heart. This was because he felt that his lifespan was nearing its end and his physical body would collapse at any moment. He felt that he was seriously injured to the point where he was about to die. Just a gaze transmitted through the air, and it was enough to beat me to the brink of death. The Holy Orzin's strength has already reached such a level. After Fang Xingjian said this, he left without looking back. At the same time, he ordered, "Keep an eye on him. Don't let him run away." Me. Zhou Xingwen was still in shock from the Holy Orzin's letter. When he heard Fang Xingjian telling him to keep an eye on Deputy Governor Armstrong, he immediately got a shock and said, Me? Keep an eye on Lord Armstrong?" In his current state, any knight would find it hard to deal with him. Just keep an eye on him and don't let him escape or commit suicide. I'll be back in a while. According to Fang Xingjian's judgment, it was true that Armstrong, who had the Holy Orzin as his backing, would be able to return in a while. However, what he did not know was that Armstrong was not an ordinary level 29 conferred knight. Hints of purple fog drifted out from Armstrong's body, instantly taking on the first prince's human form. Feng Xingjian turned his head abruptly, his expression extremely guarded. Armstrong, to think that you're also one of the 36 clones in the Hell's Map? Armstrong paid no heed to Feng Xingjian. He half knelt down toward the faint purple smoke-shaped figure and said, "Your subordinate has failed in his mission. Please forgive me, Your Highness." The first prince did not say anything. He merely threw a glance toward Feng Xingjian and said coldly, "I didn't expect that you'd be able to cozy up to the church." However, the first prince was clearly not paying attention to Feng Xingjian. Instead, it was the letter Feng Xingjian had. After throwing a few glances toward Feng Xingjian, the first prince no longer paid him any heed. He continued to look at the letter and said, "But is the Holy Orison really that amazing? After I step into the divine level, I'll personally make a trip to the Yalin's sacred mountain to pay you a visit." With that, he threw a glance toward Armstrong, feeling even more infuriated. Armstrong was the strongest contractor he had secretly planted in the Great Western region. However, he was now half-crippled, and his life was even in danger. Even if he wanted to save Armstrong, he would probably lose his battle prowess within 7 to 8 months. This would cause the first prince to completely lose a great helper and his control over the Great Western region. Feng Xingjian glared at Feng Xingjian fiercely, then grabbed Armstrong with one hand and slowly retreated. Just as Feng Xingjian was contemplating how much power the Holy Orison in the letter still had and whether he should give chase, the first prince and Armstrong gradually dissipated. It was as if they had turned into a lump of air currents, dissipating into the air and disappearing like an illusion. Feng Xingjian let out a breath, wearing a helpless expression. He had activated his heaven's perception at full power earlier, and had also continuously used the unparalleled sword intent, Apex, to scan for any flaws in Armstrong and the first prince. However, even though his clone was severely injured, he was still unable to find any flaws on the first prince's body. He did not give Feng Xingjian any chance to attack. Moreover, the first prince kept on emitting information, as if he was going to step into a new world at any moment. The information gathered from the ether particles in the surroundings all sensed a great threat. It was as if all of them were warning Feng Xingjian not to attack. Feng Xingjian had thought that he had improved a lot during this period of time, and was even able to defeat a level 25 conferred knight. However, by the looks of it, the first prince had become even more terrifying. I still need to increase my speed. That's good too. After this arbitration, I'll have more money and time to cultivate. With enough money, I should be able to cultivate the first level of the mystical prince. Thinking of this, Feng Xingjian turned and continued to walk away. Zhou Xingwen threw a glance at the place where the first prince had disappeared with a pale countenance, and then followed closely behind Feng Xingjian. Sally sat on the platform and asked one last time, "I'll ask one more time. Do you guys have anything else to say? If not, then today's arbitration will end here." Just then, Feng Xingjian kicked the door of the conference hall open fiercely. With a bang, it flew out and landed heavily on the ground, sending dust flying everywhere. Feng Xingjian. Sally stood up abruptly and looked at Feng Xingjian, who had a calm expression on his face. It was as if he could still feel the faint pain on his back. Sasa turned and looked at Feng Xingjian as if he was looking at a dead man. The corners of his lips curled up slightly as he thought, "I thought that this guy had already escaped. To think that he came here himself. He really doesn't know what's good for him." Holt's gaze turned toward Feng Xingjian. He had originally wanted to catch up and surpass Feng Xingjian, treating him as his lifelong enemy. However, seeing that Feng Xingjian was being destroyed bit by bit, other than feeling that it was a pity, he also had some other thoughts. It's true that talent and battle prowess are very important. However, before one becomes a divine-level expert, connections, background, and accumulation are even more important. Moreover, how many people are able to become divine-level experts? Chapter 340. Lilia stood up abruptly, and the armrest that she was gripping so tightly that slight cracks almost appeared. Ferdinand patted her back and said, "It's all right. Since Xinjiang is willing to come, he must have a solution." However, even more people surged forth in that instant, turning into countless malicious intents and dashing toward Fang Xingjian. "You're the one who created the rebirth sword technique. What rubbish sword technique is this? Do you know how many people you've killed? Can someone like this be considered a genius nurtured by the regional academy?" The members of the upper echelon nowadays are getting more and more shameless. Hearing the seething curses from the crowd, Fang Xingjian's brows furrowed even more. Finally, he took a step forward, stomping fiercely on the ground. With this stomp, it was as if there was a flash of sword light in the air. Fang Xingjian's leg seemed to have turned into a sharp sword, piercing into the ground. Using his leg as a sword, he activated Fang Xingjian's level 40 phenomena sword formation. This sword formation was a combination of the thunderbolt sword technique, the mountain shifting sword, and the aquatic sword formation. It allowed one to control the powers of thunderbolts, geomagnetism, and water vapor within the sword formation through the setting up of the sword formation. Everyone present felt as if the ground was trembling, and screams rang out incessantly. It was as if the end of the world had come. The terrifying tremor directly suppressed everyone's voice. After the tremor stopped, the scene was already quiet. Not a single sound could be heard. Sally stared at Fang Xingjian. This guy? His sword arts have improved again? However, she continued to look at Fang Xingjian without any fear and said, "Fang Xingjian, what are you thinking of doing? Are you going to attack the arbitration group? I'm just letting them quieten down." Fang Xingjian lifted his head and swept his gaze across the entire spectator stand, saying, "A bunch of people who aren't even conferred knights. Do you guys really know sword arts? If you don't know sword arts and haven't even seen the rebirth sword technique before, what right do you have to speak up? Don't be mistaken. No matter what you say, the outcome of today's arbitration has nothing to do with you." Sally glared coldly at Fang Xingjian and said, "Fang Xingjian, you might not be aware of the current situation. The association has already discovered that over 104 people across the country have experienced various degrees of internal organ failure after cultivating the rebirth sword technique. Moreover, the Myriad Stars Palace's astral ancestor's eldest disciple, Master Lawrence, and the School of Sword Arts Supreme Chief, Master Hung Tianxiao, have both sent us documents to prove that there's a problem with the rebirth sword technique." Hearing that, Fang Xingjian's countenance sank. He had not expected that the other party would be so ruthless, sending so many old fellows to suppress the rebirth sword technique. If not for the Holy Orzin's letter, he would have been in deep trouble. Therefore, Fang Xingjian did not say much and directly took out the letter containing the Holy Orzin. However, just as he took out the letter, the entire envelope emitted a white light, and a terrifying consciousness rose. Looking at the envelope that was slowly floating in midair while emitting white light, everyone present felt a wave of terror gushing forth. The weaker ones felt an instinctive fear, like the fear a rabbit would feel when facing a tiger. The stronger ones felt it even more deeply. They could sense that there was a gush of information current radiating out in all directions from the envelope. Using heaven's perception to read the information, they could only sense endless light, heat, and vastness. Yes, vastness, taller than the mountains and deeper than the seas. It encompassed everything, yet did not possess everything. The air trembled slightly, and an elderly man's voice rang out in everyone's ears without holding anything back. It was the voice of a pure elder, filled with concern. "Good afternoon. I'm the 7th Guardian King of the Holy Sea of Truth. However, you guys are more used to addressing me as the Holy Orzin. There's no need to be surprised. This is my ether clone. The reason I'm here today is to explain the matter regarding Fang Xingjian." Hearing the Holy Orzin's words, many people in the regional academy became excited. Lilia's and Ferdinand's faces also revealed expressions of joy. However, Sword Saint Sas's and Arbitrator Sally's countenances instantly turned extremely gloomy. Sasa frowned and cursed inwardly. Damn it. To think that a divine-level expert would come down to support someone. What kind of joke is this? The difference between a divine level expert and an ordinary knight was far too great. It was because of this that they would hold each other back and not take action casually. This time around, the Holy Orzin's appearance had clearly caught everyone off guard. Sally asked directly, "Lord Holy Orzin, are you trying to prove that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique?" But right now, over 100 cultivators across the entire country have suffered injuries after cultivating the rebirth sword technique. She did not even mention Lawrence and Hung Tianxiao. It was because their authority was clearly not comparable to the Holy Orzin's. The Holy Orzin said, "You can't suspect that this is related to the rebirth sword technique just because 100 cultivators are injured. It's because what you've obtained is just a statistical result and not the real reason. It's just like how everyone who basks in the sun will eventually die. Can it be that we don't bask in the sun anymore? Based on my experience, there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. Moreover, I've already cultivated it to level 10, and it can provide me with 8,000 potential points every day. Even ordinary apprentices without any specialties should be able to provide 4,000 to 5,000 potential points every day after cultivating the rebirth sword technique to level 10. Hearing this, a commotion broke out, and everyone's attention was focused on that 8,000 potential points. 8,000 potential points was a terrifying figure. Even though the other people present knew that they would not be as monstrous as a divine level expert, to be able to gain 4,000 to 5,000 potential points every day was a figure that they would not even dare to imagine under normal circumstances. Only cultivators would understand how great the temptation was. Moreover, this was something that the Holy Orzin had said. Who would not believe it? In the future, even if they felt that there was a problem with the rebirth sword technique, there would still be a large group of people who would not be able to resist the urge to cultivate it. Sally said with a grim countenance, "But this still won't cover up the risks of the rebirth sword technique. At the very least, we need to prove that the problems with those 100 people have nothing to do with the rebirth sword technique before everyone can cultivate it with peace of mind." However, the Holy Orzin did not follow Sally's script at all. He did not argue with Sally about the 100 people and said directly, "There's definitely no problem with the rebirth sword technique. I've already reported this matter to the church, and there'll probably be a representative group coming soon to discuss the issue of authorizing the sword technique with Feng Xingjian. Our church will be promoting this sword technique on a large scale in the next few years. And what everyone might not know is that the rebirth sword technique is also of great help to the cultivation of divine level experts. It can even slightly increase the chances of a level 29 expert striving to attain the divine level." After saying this, the Holy Orzin paused for a moment, as if letting everyone digest this astonishing piece of news. He then continued, "Moreover, I've already invited Feng Xingjian to participate in the church's martial techniques grading plan. With his talent in sword art cultivation, he could be in charge of at least 1% of the grading of sword techniques." In that instant, a commotion broke out in the hall. All sorts of astonished, and envious gazes were gathered on Feng Xingjian. Sally sat down dejectedly, her gaze filled with fury and exasperation. However, there was nothing she could do about the situation. Chapter 341. The Holy Orzin's authority was too strong. A divine-level expert could change a country's situation with just a single thought, changing the direction of history. Who would dare to doubt his words? Who would have the right to doubt him? This was especially so when they heard that the Holy See of Truth was going to promote the rebirth sword technique on a large scale. How world-shaking was this? If a divine-level expert was said to be an individual's authority, then as the strongest influence in the world, the Holy See of Truth was the target that various countries and organizations would fight to imitate. They were the most advanced and top-notch representatives. Hearing the Holy Orzin's words, a commotion broke out among the crowd in the hall. The church is going to promote the rebirth sword technique as well. Since the church is going to promote it, then there shouldn't be any problems, right? Moreover, it's impossible for the Guardian Kings to lie. And to think that the rebirth sword technique is able to improve even divine level experts? Of course, The 16 guardian kings in the church are all extremely talented and have high levels of cultivation. If they feel that there's no problem, then there's definitely no problem. Other than the Pope, the guardian kings are the existences closest to the God of universal truth. They won't make any mistakes. The church isn't a fool. If there's really a problem with the rebirth sword technique, why would they promote it? The rebirth sword technique can stimulate 4,000 to 5,000 potential points every day. It's really amazing. I wonder when I'll be able to learn it. Some people started to revere the holy sea of truth's prestige and abilities. Some people believed in the guardian king's judgment. Some people just became believers of the holy sea of truth, and some people coveted the effects of the rebirth sword technique. Seeing the sudden change in the crowd, Sasa clenched his fists angrily. These useless people only follow what others say, believing whatever the holy sea of truth says casually. Everything they say is just the church's authority. If the North were to attack, I think they're a bunch of traitors. Sally's countenance turned increasingly cold, but there was nothing she could do about it. The testimony of a divine-level expert was not something she could refute. Even if the Emperor or the myriad stars palace's astral ancestor were to come today, they would probably be on par with each other. After all, they were the guardian kings of the holy sea of truth. Putting aside the North's power, there were many believers of the church in the country alone. In the end, out of the 6 sword arts masters and Sally was the only one who insisted on voting that there was a problem with the rebirth sword technique. Therefore, the arbitration came to an end, and Sally was unable to officially announce that there was a problem with the rebirth sword technique. She could only report the results to the association and wait for further instructions. On the platform, Sally watched coldly as everyone left. She knew that even if the association continued to hold on to this matter, it would be useless. As long as the Holy Sea of Truth really started to promote the rebirth sword technique in the North, then the Empire would have no choice but to follow suit. Otherwise, the difference in battle prowess between the two would increase once again. Furthermore, even if the Empire still wanted to ban it, Sally knew that it was impossible to do so based on the current atmosphere. In the end, other than Sally, the other 6 swordsmiths who participated in the arbitration all voted in favor of the Holy Orzin's decision. They had no choice. They were several levels lower than the Holy Orzin in terms of seniority and cultivation. So how could they possibly go against the Holy Orzin's judgment? Therefore, she had no choice but to announce the end of the arbitration. She watched as everyone left, watched as the people from the regional academy walked together happily, and watched as countless people excitedly anticipated the cultivation of the rebirth sword technique. Simultaneously, when she saw the attitude of the Holy Orzin and the Holy Sea of Truth in the depths of her heart, she subconsciously started to have doubts. Could it be that there really isn't any problem with the rebirth sword technique? Lilia and Ferdinand surrounded Feng Xingjian. Lilia hugged Feng Xingjian's arm excitedly, and Feng Xingjian felt something soft pressing against his arm. However, Lilia clearly did not notice this. She said excitedly, "Teacher, there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. I knew that there would be no problem with it." "Oh, right. Lord Guardian King has invited you to participate in the martial techniques grading plan? What's that? Isn't it very amazing?" "Of course it's very amazing." As they spoke, James, Hops, and the others had already walked toward the door and arrived next to Feng Xingjian. James nodded toward Feng Xingjian and said, "Xingjian, it's all thanks to the Guardian King's help this time around. If there's a chance, you must thank him properly." "Sigh, we've made a mistake this time around. I didn't expect that in order to suppress the rebirth sword technique, they would go so crazy." He then looked toward Lilia and said with a smile, "I heard her calling you teacher." She's a disciple I took in when I was in Cursed." James nodded and said to Lilia, "Young lady, the church's martial techniques grading plan isn't an ordinary plan. It's a plan that will change the world. Within the Empire, only a few divine-level experts have been invited to participate in this plan." James then smiled and looked at Feng Xingjian, his eyes filled with admiration and anticipation. "Xingjian, You should be the first non-divine level expert to be invited within the Empire. You've really brought great honor to our great Western region." Just then, everyone suddenly fell silent. It was because Holt, who was a follower of a divine level expert and had handed over the letter from the Myriad Stars Palace's Master Lawrence, walked over. Right now, Holt was still as graceful as when they had first met. However, there were hints of vicissitudes in his eyes. Sensing everyone's hostility, Holt let out a bitter laugh and said, "I'm sorry, but teacher's thoughts don't represent mine." He looked toward Fong Xingjian and said, "Xingjian, you're still the opponent I want to surpass and defeat the most. I'm glad that you're all right this time around." With that, he left, leaving behind everyone who seemed to be deep in thought. Just then, a teacher suddenly called out, "Sasa, you're thinking of leaving just like that?" Sword Saint Sasa had left quickly through the main door, clearly not wanting to greet the people from the regional academy. However, now that he had been called out, he had no choice but to stop. Looking at everyone, he said calmly, "I'm just stating the truth. Do you guys have any problems?" James narrowed his eyes, as if trying to conceal his killing intent. "Stating the truth? Sasa, from today onward, all of your work in the Great Western Region's Regional Academy will stop for now and wait for our adjustments." Sasa shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter. After all, I've already finished researching the dragon's scale on the ancient era's relic. I can take this opportunity to do some research." Since he had already fallen out with them, it was impossible for him to apologize and reconcile with the other party. Therefore, he might as well go all out. What? He's already succeeded in deciphering that ancient era's relic? So, that ancient era's relic is called the dragon's scale. This guy took advantage of the fact that Xingjian was being held back by the arbitrator to finish his research. Despicable guy. Sasa smiled. "I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'll be going back to analyze the sword intent." One of the teachers was so infuriated that he wanted to make a move. However, he was stopped by James. "We'll talk when we get back." James had already made up his mind to teach Sasa a lesson when they returned to the regional academy. However, they were in public, and the Knight Association's arbitration team was right behind them. Moreover, this was a government organization. How could they possibly make the first move? This was especially when they had argued earlier and many people had looked over. This made it even more difficult for them to make a move. Everyone could only watch as Sasa left with a relaxed expression. However, Sasa had only taken a few steps when a voice rang out in his ears, causing his footsteps to freeze. "Gue Mei pursues Wu Wang. Wu Wang pursues Tong Run. Tong Ren pursues to you. From A to C, C to Gung, and Gung to Gue." Chapter 342. The two parties had been arguing very loudly to begin with, and when the arbitrator was about to leave, many spectators walked out and saw the scene of the two parties arguing. There were at least over 100 people who were looking over. James and Fong Xingjian were communicating with each other through information currents. "Head of department, if you were to make the first move, you guys would be able to retaliate, right?" "Of course, but he's not a fool. He won't make a move in such a situation. I can try to infuriate him. Are you sure? Try your best." The information exchange was completed in an instant. They had thought that it would end after Sasa left. However, Sasa stopped in his tracks, turned around, and glared at Fong Xingjian. Fong Xingjian said, "Do you still want me to continue reading?" "You." Sasa's mind was in a mess. He could not understand how Fong Xingjian had found out about the information in the sword intent. Fong Xingjian continued, "Are you sure that the content you analyzed is real?" As he spoke, an awe-inspiring aura was emitted from his body. "I can recite all the information you've obtained. It's because I was the one who put it in." Sasa's mind felt as if it had exploded. His eyes were bloodshot, and it was obvious that he was extremely infuriated. You. He was so infuriated that he could not say a word. Only the heavens knew how much he valued the dragon's scale and its contents. During this period of time, he had been studying it tirelessly, placing all his hopes on it. He had even gone to the extent of initiating this arbitration for the rebirth sword technique. After spending so much effort, all he got in the end was a piece of information that Feng Xingjian had casually inputted in. How could he possibly admit to this? Earlier, he had been contentedly arguing with Feng Xingjian. The difference between the former and the latter was far too great. Feng Xingjian, you really deserve to die. Overwhelmed by fury, he put out one hand and grabbed toward Feng Xingjian, hand over the real heaven's volition, sword intent. However, the moment he made his move, he was blocked by head of department James and team leader Hops, one on the left and one on the right. James bellowed furiously, Sasa, how dare you? Are you thinking of attacking a Confer Knight here? Sasa was stunned for a moment and had a bad feeling. After all, he was a level 29 Confer Knight. His rage only lasted for an instant, and he wanted to retreat. However, Governor Devitt had been waiting there since an unknown time. With a light tap of his finger, a gust of cold air gushed forth, causing Sasa to not dare to move in the slightest. Governor Devitt, head of department James, and Leader Hops were all top-notch second transition level 29 Confer Knights. Being surrounded by the three of them, Sasa's countenance turned extremely grim. What are you guys trying to do? The Great Western Region Regional Academy's rules forbid teachers from assaulting students. You've just assaulted the conferred Knight Feng Xingjian. Of course, we'll have to capture you and confine you to receive punishment. You want to ground me? Even if I attacked him, the Knight Association would be in charge of that, Sasa said angrily. James grinned coldly. The Academy has a certain degree of autonomy. How can we report a small matter like what you did earlier to the association? We'll just have to ground you for a few days. Sally shouted loudly from the back. What are you guys doing? Stop. Private fights between conferred knights are forbidden. However, no one cared about what she said. Governor Devitt smiled and said, Arbitrator Sally, we're just punishing Teacher Sasa for going against the Academy's rules. The association won't be able to interfere in this. Sasa looked at the three conferred knights who were glaring at him fiercely, and his heart sank bit by bit. In the next moment, his body suddenly flashed, and using his finger as a sword, he pierced out toward Feng Xingjian, which conferred knight was not powerful, extremely egoistic and lawless. The reason why they were under the Knight Association's control was only because the association was powerful enough to suppress them. However, Sasa knew that once he was suppressed by the three of them and locked up in the regional academy, only the heavens knew what would happen. He was not a fool and would not just sit and wait for death. Therefore, the moment he made his move, he targeted Feng Xingjian's weakest point. With a tap of his finger, sword cheese moved about, and it was as if the space had been pierced through by this sword attack of his. An obscure, formless, yet sharp aura pierced out, piercing toward Feng Xingjian's body. It was Sword Saint Sasa's job technique, the strongest job technique from the Desert Sword Saint, penetrating invisible sword cheese. It could directly affect one's powers onto atomic structures, disintegrating all living things and breaking down the structures of various physical substances. The only weakness of this penetrating invisible sword cheese was that its speed was rather slow. However, Sword Saint Sasa had been cultivating various techniques over the years to synthesize them into penetrating invisible sword cheese. Not only did it increase the speed of the sword cheese, but also brought along the powers of thunder, flames, high temperature, and low temperature. All objects struck by the sword cheese would first be violently disintegrated. Even if their structures were tough and could not be disintegrated, they would then be attacked by 12 different powers, including high temperature, low temperature, piercing, tremors, lightning, and so on. Even if ordinary conferred knights could rely on the toughness of their bodies, their treasured armors, or their killing techniques to increase the toughness of materials to fend off the violent disintegration, they would usually not be able to withstand the subsequent 12 consecutive attacks. In Sasa's opinion, if Feng Xingjian were to receive this attack, he would definitely die. The others would definitely go and save him, allowing Sasa to find an opportunity to break out of the siege. Everyone thought the same way, or rather, Governor Devitt, head of department James, and Hops all thought the same. It was because Sasa's speed was far too fast. It was like a lightning bolt, and only the three of them were able to react to it. However, just as they were about to take action, an awe-inspiring aura soared into the air, gushing out endlessly from Feng Xingjian's body. What is this? Just as Sasa was thinking about this, Feng Xingjian's voice had already turned into information currents, gushing into his brain. Didn't you want the heavens' volition sword intent? And have a good feel of its prowess. It turned out that over the past few days, Feng Xingjian had once again accumulated 100,000 potential points in addition to his original potential points. Now that he had depleted all of them, he once again activated the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent. Faced with the gushing, invisible sword cheese, a total of 600 streams of ether sword ripples gushed out, which was equivalent to 1,500 Feng Xingjian attacking at the same time. Moreover, they were all under the effects of the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent. In almost an instant, they completely wiped out the gushing, invisible sword cheese. Then with a wave of Feng Xingjian's hand, over 10 blood swords shot out and sank into the ground, setting up the phenomena sword formation. Within a range of 10 meters, countless electric sparks, water vapor, and sand rose up, forming a shield before Feng Xingjian, temporarily blocking the few more streams of invisible sword cheese that Sasa had shot out. Sasa let out an enraged bellow as he took on James's finger, Hops's kick, and Devitt's punch head-on. Fresh blood spurted out from his body, his internal organs turned into mush, and his bones were almost shattered. However, he still managed to charge up to Feng Xingjian. With a sweep of his hands, a myriad of invisible sword cheese gushed out, tearing the thunderbolts, land, and water vapor into dust. Looking at how panicked Feng Xingjian was, Sasa laughed maniacally in his heart. The remaining sword cheese gushed forth, wanting to tear Feng Xingjian into dust. However, at the next moment, as light and shadow intersected, the clone formed by the phenomena sword formation shattered in that instant. Sasa was taken by surprise, but he discovered that a gush of cold air had already frozen his feet. Then James and Hops each pressed a hand down on his shoulder, one on the left and one on the right. Under the suppression of the majestic powers, his body was unable to move at all. However, he still opened his eyes wide and looked toward Feng Xingjian, who was hiding several tens of meters away. He asked why. Through my heaven's perception, that clone from earlier looked exactly the same as you. Why is it fake? It's easy for the clone formed by the phenomena sword formation to deceive others, but how could it possibly deceive me? Chapter 343. The third level of the Killing Techniques Palace was a combination of the Myriad Sword Formation, the Thunderbolt Sword Technique, the Mountain Shifting Sword Technique, and the Aquatic Sword Formation. It could control thunderbolts, move mountains and rivers, and even control great rivers. When they were used interchangeably, they could create fog, heavy rain, ice, and even storms. They could create mountains and rivers, and they could control the forces of the earth, forming and moving the earth, forming all sorts of shapes. Wind, rain, snow, and snow could almost replicate most of the natural phenomena in the world. Of course, their attacks were just the myriad phenomena, and it all depended on how the user used them. However, regardless of whether it was water vapor, soil, steam heated by lightning, or clay, logically speaking, it was impossible for even Sword Saint Sasa to not be able to detect the existence of a clone that was created using all sorts of random things. Faced with Sword Saint Sasa's doubt, Feng Xingjian said calmly, 30 liters of water, 20 kilograms of carbon, for liters of ammonia, 1. 5 kilograms of lime, 800 grams of phosphorus, 250 grams of salt. Looking at Sword Saint Sasa's puzzled gaze, Feng Xingjian said coldly, these things are the components of an adult's body. This is also why you weren't able to tell the difference immediately after seeing my clone. It's because his body structure and composition aren't too different from mine. Feng Xingjian looked at Sasa and said, but if you really hold me in high regard and focus more attention on me, then with your ether synchronization rate, you should be able to detect the difference. Sasa sighed and lowered his head. Although he had attacked Feng Xingjian back then, most of his attention had been placed on Governor Devitt and the other two. His heaven's perception had only scanned through Feng Xingjian's clone slightly, but he did not take it to heart. If he had been able to delve deeper and divert more attention to analyze the results of his heaven's perception, then with his level 29 cultivation and 100% ether synchronization rate, he would have been able to analyze even cells and bacteria. How could he have fallen for it? However, it was clearly too late to say anything now. Being held down by 3 conferred knights who were stronger than him, Sasa threw a cold glance at Feng Xingjian and said, "Feng Xingjian, you're very lucky. However, this won't be the end. One day, I'll snatch the Heaven's Volition sword intent back from you." His gaze toward Feng Xingjian was filled with greed. To be able to let a level 22 conferred knight exchange a blow with him within a second. What kind of power was this? However, James quickly kicked Sasa to the ground and said coldly, "Wait until you can escape from our hands." Looking at the crowd surrounding them, James and the others quickly brought him back to school. In an office in the regional academy, James nodded and sighed. To think that Armstrong is also one of the first prince's 36 clones? Governor Devitt also shook his head. I really didn't expect that Armstrong would choose this path. He then looked at Feng Xingjian with great interest and asked, "You really have to thank the Guardian King's letter for you to be able to defeat Armstrong. Can the letter still be used?" "It's no longer usable." Feng Xingjian shook his head and said, "There's no longer any information left in it." The head of the sword arts team, Hops, coughed and asked, "Then what should we do with Sasa?" Everyone present fell silent. In the end, James was the first to speak. "Imprison him. Although this guy is a traitor, he's still a conferred knight. It'll be very troublesome to kill him. But imprison him and announce to the public that he's training in seclusion." Suddenly, Feng Xingjian raised his hand and asked, "I have an opinion." James chuckled and turned, looking at Feng Xingjian as if he was looking at a treasure. He was indeed a treasure. In his eyes, the fact that Feng Xingjian had been invited to participate in the church's martial techniques grading plan meant that Feng Xingjian was already a famous character in the regional academy. He was a great treasure. Xingjian, go ahead and say it. To be honest, the results achieved by the rebirth sword technique have far surpassed our expectations. Moreover, it's all thanks to you. With such results, we should support you well. Feng Xingjian said, "I'll have the chance to spar with the Sword Saint. Of course, it won't be now. I hope to use him to hone my sword arts after I become stronger." James nodded. "I don't have any killing intent when I spar with you, but it's different for Sasa. He hates you to the core. If you spar with him, it's true that you'll be able to hone your sword arts. However, I'll have to be by your side." Therefore, Feng Xingjian once again returned to his days of practicing his sword arts and tempering his attributes. However, compared to the tranquility he was experiencing, the outside world was in an uproar. In the center of the empire stood a majestic palace. It was unknown what material the massive palace was made of, but under the sunlight, it looked as if it had been sprayed with a layer of golden paint. The Forbidden Army in golden armor kept guarding the palace. There were various pavilions, terraces, and buildings, as well as waterside pavilions. It was as if there was an endless amount of luxury and enjoyment. On the ground, these were just the places where the palace maids and soldiers stayed. In the sky, there were over 100 palaces floating in the clouds. They were all built from various expensive metals, and the roofs were filled with gems that emitted a 5-colored glow. It was as if they were overflowing with wealth. From afar, one would feel as if they were looking at the divine realm or the celestial realm. This was a building that even the modern Earth would not be able to create. It was because they had used the powers of divine-level experts to be able to create such miraculous buildings. In the middle of the palaces in the sky was the most dazzling, majestic, and extremely majestic palace. The second prince was kneeling down and saying, "Father, this is what happened." Right now, the second prince had a delicate appearance and was dressed in golden robes. However, it was hard to hide the refreshing and otherworldly aura he exuded. Before him, A tall and big figure was encompassed by layers of golden light, making it hard to see his appearance clearly. The second prince did not reply to the second prince's words, and the second prince did not dare to rush him. He merely knelt down and waited for the second prince to make his move. The first prince has arrived. Just then, a series of shouts rang out from outside the palace. Dressed in golden robes and armor, the second prince exuded an extremely noble and domineering aura. Before he even got close, he already let out a series of long laughter. Second brother, it's no wonder that despite so many things happening in the Great Western region, you didn't do anything. So, you've been complaining about me to father. The second prince threw a cold glance at the first prince and said, Eldest brother, the rebirth sword technique shouldn't be banned. It shouldn't be banned? The rebirth sword technique is the best nurturing sword technique that we know of at the moment. If you want to promote it, do you want everyone in the world, including those nobles and ants, to cultivate the same set of sword technique as us? Are you afraid that their powers won't be able to catch up to the royal family? Do you want them to threaten the royal family? Do you know how many ambitious people will be born if this set of sword technique is spread out? The world will be in a state of unrest. The second prince shook his head and said, Everyone's abilities will be raised, but the disparity between us will still remain the same. Only when the citizens' abilities are raised and their living standards are raised will our country become more prosperous and powerful. We should be raising the abilities of every citizen and not be on guard against them all day and night, oppressing them. Chapter 344. Commoners are fools. They've grasped powers that they shouldn't have and will forget themselves. Only by keeping them the way they are now will they be able to behave themselves. At this moment, a minister walked in and presented a document. Your Majesty, this is the arbitration report regarding the rebirth sword technique from the Great Western region. The figure in the light screen took the document, and not long later, a voice rang out. All right, I think that this rebirth sword technique is pretty good. Pass it. Hearing the emperor's words, the first prince glared and was about to admonish. Father, that's enough, George. As the emperor, you must be magnanimous. How can you not even accept a set of sword technique? So what if they've cultivated the rebirth sword technique? Is the ancient path of hell's martial arts not enough for you to cultivate? The men of our Creed clan can still suppress the world and lead the masses. If you don't even have this bit of boldness, how can you be the emperor? The first prince could only nod slightly, not rebuking the emperor. However, the viciousness in his eyes kept on surfacing. It was clear that he did not approve of the emperor's words. The second prince heaved a sigh of relief. With the emperor's personal orders, the matter had finally come to an end. With that, most of the knights and apprentices in the world would have the chance to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. The commoners in the world would be blessed. A few days later, the moment Ferdinand opened the door, there were many groups of people waiting outside, smiling and greeting him. Lord Ferdinand, you're awake. This is the 7 flames grass that I specially bought. Lord Ferdinand, look at the sword technique authorization from our Eastern Radiance dojo. Ferdinand smiled complacently as he watched the groups of people chasing after him and trying to get in his good books, all for the sake of getting the authorization for the rebirth sword technique and getting a good price for it. Being in control of money, being in control of power, and having countless knights crawling under his feet. Wasn't this his dream? Although he was still a little short of it, he was slowly getting closer to it. Just then, Anthony ran over, panting heavily. His face was filled with joy. Ferdinand, it's sold out. It's sold out again. A total of 100,000 copies of the Secrets to Sword Arts have been sold out. We've contacted a few printing houses, but there's no time to increase the print run. Ferdinand smiled. He could foresee that, as the rebirth sword technique was taken up by most of the academies and factions in the Empire, and even in the North, Feng Xingjian's Secrets to Sword Arts would become increasingly popular and popular. However, at the thought of this, he shook his head in pity. It's a pity that only the Great Western region can prohibit piracy. As if hearing his words, a representative from the Donyao Dojo smiled and said, Sir, our Donyao Dojo can order 500 books every year. They'll be our designated reading material. The others also reacted instantly. Our Olivier Academy can order 1,000 books. We, the Key to War College, order 1,500 copies. Ferdinand smiled and waved his hand. All right. Everyone, please calm down. We'll note it down one by one. This feeling of being in control of power, of being able to create tens of thousands of gold coins with just a single sentence, and of being able to earn over 10,000 gold coins every day, made Ferdinand unable to stop himself. In the depths of the Great Western Region Regional Academy, there was a pitch-black and damp dungeon filled with waves of resentment. Sword Saint Sasa slowly opened his eyes. He struggled a little and discovered that his body was being suppressed by something, making him unable to move at all. The density of ether particles in the dungeon was only 1% of what it usually was. Sasa himself was soaked in something that looked like cement, and every inch of his skin was being pressed down by rocks and metals that weighed several hundred tons. He did not eat, did not drink, and could not even breathe. It was already extremely tough for him to just absorb the 1/100 density of ether particles every day to stay alive. Unable to move and surrounded by pitch-black darkness, this environment could drive one crazy. Waves of resentment continued to gather in Sasa's mind, but there was nothing he could do about it. Fong Xinjian, James, and Hoppus, Devitt, just you wait. As long as you let me out, I'll make all of you pay the price. However, very soon, he no longer had any spare energy to think about these things. The absolute darkness and loneliness caused his mind to be continuously suppressed. An ordinary person would go crazy in a few days under such circumstances. Sasa gradually started to feel anxious. Holt was currently cultivating the mountain shifting sword in the second stage of the Killing Techniques Palace. Under Fong Xinjian's stimulation, he had broken through his limits time and time again, finally clearing the first stage and arriving at the second stage, the mountain shifting sword. Right now, the person guarding the second stage was still the Fatso Ronin whom Fong Xinjian had defeated in the past. Holt had gotten close to Ronin during this period of time. Knowing Holt's identity, Ronin from Fatso did not put on airs. He lifted his head and saw that Ronin was cultivating a set of sword technique that he had never seen before. Therefore, he asked curiously, "Haven't you been trying to clear the aquatic sword formation? Why have you started to cultivate other sword techniques? What kind of sword technique is this? Why have I never seen you cultivate it before?" Ronin said, "This is the rebirth sword technique. The Academy has already bought the rights to the rebirth sword technique. I heard that they're offering a discount, and it only costs 5,000 gold per year. I'm going to hurry up and cultivate this sword technique. In the future, everyone will be cultivating the rebirth sword technique, and those who don't will fall behind." While saying that, Ronin threw a glance at Holt and said, "How about it, Holt? Come and learn it as well. Potential and attributes are the most basic things for us knights. The effects of the rebirth sword technique are more than 10 times that of other nurturing sword techniques. In the future, everyone will definitely be able to learn it." Holt smiled a little awkwardly. "Let me think about it." However, for the rest of the afternoon, Holt became a little listless when he cultivated the mountain-shifting sword technique. His mind kept on going back and forth, wondering if he should also cultivate the rebirth sword technique. However, when he thought of how this sword technique was created by Fong Xinjian, he felt an indescribable discomfort in his heart. However, when he came out from the Killing Techniques Palace that day, he unknowingly came to the library and walked to the section on nurturing sword techniques. However, the moment he arrived, he was slightly stunned. "Miss Ada, why have you come to the library?" The person he had addressed as Ada was the level 24 female conferred knight, Ada, who had fought against Fong Xinjian for the aquatic sword formation back then. She was also an admirer of the Fifth Prince. As Holt had been immersed in the Killing Techniques Palace for the past half a month or so, they got to know each other. When Ada saw Holt's sudden appearance, she was slightly stunned and said a little awkwardly, I just encountered some problems and came to look for some information." Both of them appeared a little awkward. They exchanged a glance, and then continued to search for something on the bookshelves. The two of them went through the entire nurturing techniques area. When they met again, they exchanged a glance, and Ada asked, "You didn't find the information you were looking for either?" Holt smiled helplessly. "I'll continue searching." Just then, a librarian said, "The two of you must be looking for the manual for the rebirth sword technique, right? They've all been borrowed today. This rebirth sword technique has a total of 20,000 words, and they'll probably take a very long time to read through it. If you want to borrow it, you'd better come back in a few days." There were only a total of 50 to 60 students in the academy. Usually, there would definitely be enough books in the library to borrow. However, everyone wanted to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. Therefore, the books were all borrowed in a short period of time. Hearing this, Holt and Ada exchanged a glance. Their eyes were filled with awkwardness and fury. Damn it, why was this sword technique created by Feng Xingjian? Chapter 345. At the Western Society's gathering, there were many Westerners with yellow skin and black eyes. Wang Tiangang, who had been in seclusion for over 10 days, finally came out to take a breather. Back then, he had wanted to fork out 500,000 gold to borrow Feng Xingjian's sacred land, but he had been rejected. After seeing the rebirth sword technique, he had been in seclusion ever since. As a top-notch expert in the Western society, his appearance naturally attracted a lot of attention. A young man from the Western society walked over and shouted, "Young Master Wang, it's been a long time. Have you been in seclusion recently?" "That's right, young Masterly. It's rare for me to have some inspiration." Wang Tiangang smiled. Although this young man was only a knight, his family was a wealthy merchant for 5 generations. Their wealth was almost comparable to that of countries. Wang Tiangang was very willing to get on good terms with him. Within a short few minutes, a few other people walked over. They were clearly from the same circle as Wang Tiangang. The people in the surroundings looked at them with envious gazes, causing Wang Tiangang and the others to become the focus of everyone's attention. The young man who was addressed as young Masterly drank a mouthful of wine and said softly, "Have you read this morning's newspaper?" "Of course I have. Feng Xingjian has shot to fame overnight. Lord Holy Orzen is full of praises for him, and even His Majesty the King has praised the rebirth sword technique as an epic-making masterpiece. Many knights have switched to cultivating sword arts. That's for sure. With a difference of over 10 times in potential, the old fellows in my family are also forcing me to switch to cultivating the rebirth sword technique. He's really famous. This Feng Xingjian is only 17 years old. This time, he can be considered to have gone down in history." Wang Tiangong's brows furrowed slightly, as if his mood had turned bad. Suddenly, young Masterly turned and asked him, "Young Master Wang, you're also an expert in sword arts. How is it? Do you want to cultivate the rebirth sword technique?" Wang Tiangang looked at his stats window, which was now at level 1. He smiled and said, "I'll consider it. After all, the rebirth sword technique will take a very long time to cultivate. It's a little difficult, but the efficiency is really high. Haven't you guys heard? After Lord Holy Orzen reached level 10, he could activate 8,000 potential points every day. Anyway, I'm planning to train it. Whoever doesn't train it will fall behind." At this moment, there was a commotion in the crowd. Wang Tiangang also turned around to look, and his brows furrowed even more. This was because Feng Xingjian and Zhou Xingwen had actually come to the Western Society's gathering together. Wang Tiangang said unhappily, "Feng Xingjian didn't participate in the Western meeting, right? How is he able to come?" Young Masterly said with a tinge of jealousy, "He's a celebrity. Who would stop him? I heard that over 20 academies have managed to get the rights to the rebirth sword technique for 10,000 gold per year. This means that even if Feng Xingjian were to lie down and not do anything, he would be able to earn over 200,000 gold per year." Hearing his words, the people around him gasped and looked at Feng Xingjian enviously. Wang Tiangang could not help but twitch his lips and say, "I was just lucky." The people at the side chimed in, and a young man suddenly said, "Hee hee, I'll go and say hello. I'll go as well. Haha, I haven't seen young Master Zhou for a long time. I'll go and take a look as well. As the people around him left one by one, everyone's gazes turned from him to Fang Xingjian, the upstart. A strong sense of disappointment welled up in Wang Tiangong's heart. He looked at young Master Li and said, "This bunch of people are really opportunistic. What's the point of going up like this?" Young Master Li was stunned for a moment before saying, "That's true. There are too many people. I'd better wait for the gathering to end before looking for Fang Xingjian to have a chat." However, he turned and discovered that Wang Tiangong had already left. "Young Master Wang, why did you leave? You're classmates with Fang Xingjian, right? Can you introduce me to him?" Wang Tiangong turned and said coldly, "I'm not close to him." As he walked out, he looked at Fang Xingjian, who had become the center of attention for the gathering. He could not help but sigh inwardly. How good would it be if I was the one who invented the rebirth sword technique? Thinking of this, he quickened his pace. Isn't it just a nurturing sword technique? Announcing it now will only benefit others. After I cultivate your sword technique and get into the top 10 in next year's national selection, becoming a royal knight, I'll still be left far behind. Fang Xingjian had already been surrounded by countless people who were chatting enthusiastically. "Xingjian, it's been tough on you this time around. I heard that you were under a lot of pressure this time around. How did you create the rebirth sword technique?" "Xingjian, are there any tricks to the rebirth sword technique? I can't seem to master it." After exchanging a few words, Zhou Xingwen led Fang Xingjian to a corner, but he still attracted the gazes of most people. Zhou Xingwen made the introductions. "Young Master Wu, this is our great genius, Fang Xingjian. Xingjian, this is young Master Wu. Half of the rice business in the great western city belongs to young Master Wu's family." Fang Xingjian nodded. "Nice to meet you." Young Master Wu laughed out loud, patted Fang Xingjian's shoulder intimately, and said, "Xingjian, you've really helped us Westerners win some glory this time around. Our family has opened a martial arts dojo. Do you want to be a nominal teacher in our dojo? I don't have much time." "I know you're busy. You could just be a nominal teacher. Every year, you'll just have to find time to come and teach one lesson. The salary will be 5,000 gold a year. I'll get someone to transfer it to you immediately." Fang Xingjian's brows twitched. Teaching one lesson a year, this was clearly giving him money. He had only come to participate after Zhou Xingwen had repeatedly persuaded him that this gathering was specially organized for him, and that there would be many people who would give him money. He had not expected that Zhou Xingwen would really be so direct. The other talents also started to make a ruckus. Some of them wanted him to be a nominal teacher in their academy or martial arts dojo, while others wanted him to invest in their businesses. With Zhou Xingwen's help, Fang Xingjian either agreed or rejected all of them. Within a short half an hour, he had already earned 70,000 gold and gained over 10 titles. This money came to him faster than robbing others. "Oh, right. Xingjian, do you have a bank account?" a young man asked. Fang Xingjian looked at the chubby young man who looked like the Methria Buddha and recalled Zhou Xingwen's introduction. This was the son of the great western city's bank's head, Song Wuji. The empire's bank had been opened by the second prince 2 years ago. It was different from those shops in small cities. This was a national bank established by the country. Although it only covered the major first-tier cities, its reputation and liquidity were not something others could compare to. After the second prince's hard work over the past 2 years, it had become the favorite place for aristocrats to save their money. Seeing Fang Xingjian shake his head, Song Wuji smiled and said, "I'll get someone to open an account for you. You'll be earning more than all of us, so how can you not open an account? There's no need for you to go over. I'll get someone to open an account for you now. You guys can just transfer the money in later." Just like that, Fang Xingjian managed to earn 70,000 gold as an investment, an additional bank account, and a series of titles. 2 hours later, he left the gathering, leaving Zhou Xingwen alone with a radiant smile on his face. "Old Zhou, you've participated in the authorization for the rebirth sword technique. You've struck it rich this time." Not at all. Young Master Wu, I heard that your uncle is from the northern military region. We'll have to trouble you in the future. And young Master Li, your aunt is in the eastern sand region. right? I'll need to talk to the regional academy there about the royalties for the rebirth sword technique. I'll need your help. Fang Xingjian walked casually on his way back to the academy, still practicing his sword technique in his mind. With the 70,000 gold he had earned today, in addition to the 50,000 gold he had received from the sword tower, he now had 120,000 gold. He could cultivate the first level of the mystical prince. In addition to the royalties that would soon arrive in his account, as well as the money he had earned from selling half of Gao Tu's corpse, he reckoned that he would be able to cultivate the second or even third level of the mystical prince. He had been looking forward to this ultimate technique that his mother had invented and was said to be able to increase a conferred knight's cultivation speed. However, when he thought of the time, Fang Xingjian felt pressured once again. It was already the end of August, and it had been almost 2 months since he had come to the regional academy. There were still 10 more months to the national selection next year. He was only left with 3 years and 10 months to live. However, when he was halfway there, a figure suddenly dashed out. It was arbitrator Sally. Chapter 346. Seeing Sally's sudden appearance, Fang Xingjian's brows twitched and he asked, "What's the matter this time?" "Heaven-shaking sword Potter is dead." She stared at Fang Xingjian and said, "It said that Armstrong failed to attack you in the city hall. He's one of the first prince's clones. Was he the one who did it? Was he the one who killed Potter?" Fang Xingjian threw a glance at her and was about to leave. Under his gaze, Sally felt a numbness on her shoulder, as if she was reminded of the pain of her wings being torn apart. However, she still gritted her teeth and followed after him. Fang Xingjian said calmly, "After the arbitration is over, you should return immediately." Sally lowered her head and said, "I can't just leave without knowing the reason. Is there really no problem with the rebirth sword technique? You'll know once you cultivate it yourself." Just then, a little girl walked up to Fang Xingjian with a flower basket. "Sir, would you like to buy a flower for your wife?" Sally's face turned red, and she felt her shoulder becoming even more numb. She said, "Little girl, don't spout nonsense. There's nothing between us." That little girl was stunned for a moment. Then she moved closer to Fang Xingjian's calf and said, "Big brother, buy some flowers." Fang Xingjian shook his head and was about to leave when the little girl hugged his legs. "Big brother, please buy some flowers." Sally, who was at the side, said, "You're too heartless. Little girl, don't beg him. I want your flowers." Fang Xingjian threw a glance at Sally and suddenly raised his brows. With one hand, he blocked the little girl's tongue, which had stuck out from her mouth, in front of his face. At the same time, his leg flew up, and under the conversion of his sword bones, it turned into a surge of sword force, tearing apart the little girl's hands that were hugging him. She was then sent flying. Just as Fang Xingjian swept the little girl away, the ground under his feet trembled. 2 hands reached out from underground, grabbing toward Fang Xingjian's calf. Fang Xingjian felt an extremely scorching sensation rising from his opponent's hands. What made him even more astonished was that the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor actually revealed a hint of hesitation. It did not defend or counterattack the scorching heat coming from his hands. Therefore, when Fang Xingjian's hands came into contact with the water on his body started to evaporate. If he allowed the other party to continue attacking him like this, he would probably turn into a mummy within a few seconds. Fang Xingjian let out a cold snort, and ether sword ripples swept across the air. Fang Xingjian's 2 hands were chopped off, and as blood gushed out like a fountain, the 2 bare arms retracted back. Fang Xingjian stomped down again, activating the phenomena sword formation. The sword force was overwhelming, and the powerful geomagnetic forces spread out like a material substance. The earth trembled, and layers of soil and rocks pressed down, as if wanting to crush the assassin into a meat patty. Simultaneously, Fang Xingjian lifted his head and looked at the little girl who was charging toward him once again. Right now, the little girl's expression was savage and filled with vengeance. Her long tongue was filled with barbs, piercing toward Fang Xingjian's face like a long spear. trying to act mysterious. Violent information currents swept out, and a voice rang out in the other party's mind. Then it exploded, and the little girl let out an agonizing cry and fell to the ground. Stimulated by Fong Xingjian's martial will, she clutched her head and cried out in agony. A faint light lit up on Fong Xingjian's back as the Zenith Light Sword formation was activated. He wanted to burn the little girl into charcoal with a stream of light sword. Just then, Sally abruptly stood in front of the little girl, glaring at Fong Xingjian. The conferred knight's actions were too fast, but his voice was too slow. There was no time for him to speak at all. Sally used information transmission to say, "What are you trying to do?" She's still a child. However, at the next moment, the ground trembled once again, and a stone spike pierced out under the phenomena sword formation's control, turning the little girl into a meat skewer. A large hole was pierced through her stomach, and the little girl struggled and cried out in agony. Sally said furiously, "Fong Xingjian, do you still have any humanity left in you? How could you lay your hands on a child?" However, Fong Xingjian did not pay her any heed. His eyes stared at the ground, as if he could see through it and see everything. At the next moment, he jumped slightly, and the ground within a range of 100 meters under his feet turned into yellow sand. Sally let out an enraged bellow, and her calves were wrapped up by the moving yellow sand. The light wings on her back spread out. However, one of the light wings, which had originally been in good condition, was now clearly a few times smaller than the others. It was clearly the light wing that Fong Xingjian had torn off previously. Moreover, this thing did not grow as fast as the other parts of her body, causing Sally's movements to be slightly sluggish. However, in the blink of an eye, she had already squeezed through space, passed through gaps, and arrived in midair with the little girl. Looking at the yellow sand that had spread out within a range of 100 meters, she immediately said furiously through information currents, "It's the people from the sand country. Be careful not to come into contact with their real bodies. Their sand country's barrier can suck everything dry and turn them into sand." The moment Sally finished her words, over 100 palms of sand, which were the size of trucks, reached out toward Fong Xingjian, who was in the sky. It was as if over 100 trucks were crashing down together. Just the astonishing prowess alone was enough to cause ordinary people to be shocked silly. The area of the attacks was too wide. The buildings on both sides of the streets sank into the desert, and cries of astonishment rang out incessantly from within the buildings. Faced with this attack, Fong Xingjian let out a cold snort and tapped out consecutively with his sword fingers. 12 streams of blood swords shot out from his fingertips, scattering across the surrounding space in the blink of an eye. He had truly set up the phenomena sword formation. Then the water vapor in the sky condensed, and swooshing sounds rang out. It was as if a great river had suddenly appeared, gushing out toward the sand with a rumble. The sand was washed away by the water, turning into mud once again. Then 6 light spots kept flashing on Fong Xingjian's back. The Zenith Light Sword formation was activated, and the light swords swept out consecutively, heating up the mud and turning it back into hard ground. Before the people in the sand could react, Fong Xingjian had already stomped down on the soil. A muffled bang rang out under his feet, and under the phenomena sword formation, geomagnetic forces exploded crazily. Waves of muffled thunderous sounds rang out incessantly from the depths of the earth. Within a few seconds, the ground within a range of 100 meters was being compressed. In the blink of an eye, the ground under Fong Xingjian's feet had been compressed until it was as hard as cement. The 6 light spots of the Zenith Light Sword formation kept on spinning behind Fong Xingjian's head, as if ready to defend against attacks at any moment. Fong Xingjian pointed out with his sword, and the ground started to churn. 2 people covered in soil rose up from the ground. They had yellow eyes and brown skin. They were the Dis people from the sand country. Sally looked at this scene in great astonishment. People from the sand country? Why are they here? Is it for the heavenly abyss annihilation armor? Fong Xingjian said calmly. The 2 of you are also at the second transition, right? Or level 23. or level 24. To think that you would travel such a great distance to the great western region to assassinate me. Why? Heretic, you've tainted the soul of the country's guardian hero. The heavens of freedom will never forgive you. Our deaths are just the beginning. There will be even stronger heroes who will come to assassinate you. You demon. The heavens of freedom was a god worshipped by countless people in the desert. These two assassins from the Sand Country were both at level 24. It was true that they had come to assassinate Feng Xingjian and snatch the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. However, they had not expected that Feng Xingjian, who had only completed his job transition for less than 2 months, had already become so powerful. To think that even though the two of them had joined forces to launch a surprise attack, they had not been able to take him down. Instead, they had been easily captured by him. Hearing their words, Feng Xingjian let out a cold laugh and said, "That's just as well. I'll kill however many of them come. If there are too many of them, then when I attain the divine level, I'll definitely go to your Sand Country and kill all of your so-called heavens of freedom and your country's guardian heroes." When the two of them heard Feng Xingjian's words, their countenances were infuriated, and they immediately started cursing. However, after cursing Feng Xingjian for a while, the two assassins from the Sand Country suddenly let out agonizing cries. At the next moment, they swelled up like balloons. Feng Xingjian's countenance changed. Geomagnetic forces seethed in the sword formation, tearing open the ground and throwing the two assassins in. The formation then closed up. Not long after, the ground trembled, and an explosion rang out from afar. A large number of the houses in the surroundings collapsed once again. Sally looked at this scene, unable to bear it. They should be the Sand Country's death troops. Once they fail their mission, they'll self-destruct, leaving no corpses for the enemy. To think that 2 second transition experts have died just like that. Suddenly, her countenance changed. She looked at Feng Xingjian, who was walking over with killing intent. She immediately hugged the little girl in her arms tightly and said, "What are you trying to do?" This little girl's body was only modified by the people from the Sand Country to attract your attention. Could it be that you're thinking of killing her? Chapter 347. With a flash, Feng Xingjian appeared before the little girl. Her face was filled with vengeance, and the big hole in her stomach was still bleeding incessantly. She looked more like a ghost than a human. However, as Feng Xingjian's body moved with a flash, Sally's 6 light wings flapped in unison, and she dashed out abruptly. As she carried the little girl in her arms, she shouted furiously through information currents, "Stop it, Feng Xingjian. She's just a child. It's only because the people from the Sand Country modified her body that she became a death warrior." Feng Xingjian threw a glance at the little girl. It was true that she was like a wild beast. Other than having a face filled with enmity and growling softly, she did not seem to possess any intelligence at all. Ever since the Heavenly Lord of the Blood Sea, the Sand Country's first founder, they had always been skilled in modifying the human body. They specialized in modifying ordinary people into killing machines. Just like the little girl before him, the prowess of her tongue attack at close range was equivalent to that of a level 19 knight at the pinnacle. Both of her arms had been chopped off, and a big hole had been opened up in her stomach. However, she still did not die. If it were an ordinary conferred knight who had just completed his transition 2 months ago, he would probably have died after being distracted by the little girl and then ambushed by 2 assassins who had just completed the second transition. However, the Sand Country had clearly underestimated Feng Xingjian's abilities. The assassins only knew how to wait for the chance when Feng Xingjian was alone. However, they did not know that Feng Xingjian's abilities were already sufficient to defeat a level 25 conferred knight. Feng Xingjian looked at the little girl. There was only numbness, nervousness, and pain in her emotions, just like when she had been selling flowers earlier. It was clear that she had been brainwashed and no longer had the ability to think like an ordinary person. He glanced at Sally and said indifferently, "You're ridiculous." As he spoke, he activated and stopped his boundaries negation. With a flash, he passed by Sally's body. The little girl's head flew up into the air, and her body struggled a few times before she died completely. Sally looked at the headless corpse in her arms. She showed no reaction, even when the blood splattered on her body. At the next moment, she turned her head abruptly to look at Feng Xingjian's back and said furiously, "She's just a child who's not even 10 years old. How could you kill her? She was physically modified, and she was also a victim." Feng Xingjian turned around and dashed forward. Under boundaries negation, he brazenly burst forth at a speed 15 times at a supersonic speed, and there seemed to be a long cry in the air. Sally's expression changed, and the light sword in her hand swept out continuously, turning into a heavy net of swords that enveloped Feng Xingjian. However, Feng Xingjian used his unparalleled sword intent to see through the openings and break through them one by one. Streams of seething white steam came out from his body, and Feng Xingjian kicked Sally in the chest, sending her flying over a distance of over 100 meters. She knelt on the ground and spewed out a large mouthful of blood. So long-winded, so annoying. Feng Xingjian threw a glance at Sally and said, "If you want to investigate the rebirth sword technique, go ahead and do it yourself. I'm not interested. As for who I want to kill, it has nothing to do with you. If you dare to hinder me again, I'll tear off all 6 of your wings." Sally's body trembled, and there seemed to be a numb feeling flowing past her shoulder. She even felt a warmth in her chest, which had been kicked, as if there was a feeling that she had never felt before. However, Feng Xingjian turned and left. With a few flashes, he disappeared into the night sky. Half a minute later, a few conferred knights arrived. When they saw the desolated streets and Sally, who was kneeling on the ground, slowly recovering, they exchanged a glance with grim countenances. To think that the Sand Country had really chased them all the way to the great western city to attack Feng Xingjian. Moreover, it could be imagined that unless Feng Xingjian really possessed unrivaled powers one day, for the sake of their national hero, Damarov, these devils from the desert would definitely not let the matter rest. This would probably be the first assassination attempt and not the last. Feng Xingjian, who had turned to leave, frowned and turned back to throw a glance in Sally's direction. After sending her flying with a kick, his mental cultivation method had improved tremendously. For the next few days, Feng Xingjian spent his days cultivating his sword arts, eating the delicacies that Zhou Xingwen had sent over, and tempering his attributes. He had handed over the authorizations to Ferdinand and Zhou Xingwen. All he needed to do was wait to receive the money. As for the materials needed for the cultivation of the mystical prince, he had also informed Robert. This former head of the dojo, who had participated in the prefectural selection and come to the regional academy together with him, was now completely devoted to Feng Xingjian. Hearing that Feng Xingjian wanted him to gather the materials, he entered the great western city's market without another word. On this day, it was the 1st of September, the 3rd month since Feng Xingjian had come to the regional academy. Feng Xingjian sat cross-legged in the training room, his consciousness seething intensely. Many skill seeds emitted a brilliant glow, as if his entire consciousness had turned into a brilliant galaxy. The skill seed representing the phenomena sword formation and the lightless sword clashed intensely, and countless pieces of information flowed between them. At the next moment, the skill seed representing the level 40 lightless sword shattered, and all the information related to the lightless sword disappeared from Feng Xingjian's mind in that instant. I failed. Feng Xingjian shook his head and looked at the stone wall before him. The secret manual for the lightless sword was carved on it. Although he had failed, Feng Xingjian had been fully focused on his cultivation during this period of time. Coupled with the headmaster's full support, as well as the consumption of various ferocious beasts and heavenly and earthly treasures daily, his physique had been continuously strengthened. His abilities had continued to grow by leaps and bounds. His waves had improved further, reaching level 3 for the prodigious astral divine powers waves. The area of effect for terra ingurgitation had also reached a range of 3 kilometers, and its prowess was over 9 times that of level 1. After the arbitration had ended, Sword Saint Sasa had been captured, and Sally had been beaten up twice by him. Fang Xingjian's mental cultivation method had improved by quite a few notches. This time around, his universal sword dominance lunisolar mental cultivation method had also reached level 6, and his ether sword ripples had achieved the effect of 3 times his strength. Therefore, Fang Xingjian's attributes had become: name Fang, Xingjian, age 17, occupation heavenly sword, sovereign level 22 strength, 126 plus 9 agility, 219 plus 9 reaction, 116 endurance, 92 flexibility, 92 ether synchronization rate, 34%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 9 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute, techniques. Boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 phenomena sword formation, level 1 lightless sword, heaven's volition sword, intense specialties, genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, apex sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense, heavenly sword imprint waves, level 3 prodigious astral divine powers wave mental cultivation method, level 6 universal sword dominance lunisolar potential, 30,000 point increase /day. Just then, Robert's voice rang out from outside the door. Xingjian, are you there? The thing is here. Chapter 348. 99 Abyss Pearls. 20 kilograms of bone powder from the wilderness blazing bird. 2 eyeballs from the southern seas great rock. In Fang Xingjian's room, the various materials needed for the mystical prince cultivation were sent in. Looking at the various rare treasures, even Robert, who had personally purchased them, had a look of astonishment and envy in his eyes. The materials for the first level of the mystical prince had cost Fang Xingjian 98,000 gold coins. Each of them was a rare treasure, a heavenly and earthly treasure that was hard to come by. Even when Fang Xingjian was in the regional academy, the food that he ate every day could not be compared to these. Fang Xingjian took out a box casually and saw a pill in it. The pill was a transparent amber color, and there was a wine-red liquid within it that was swirling and undulating incessantly. Blood of Deities. It's a medicinal pill brewed from a type of plant located in the extreme north. After consuming it, one will be able to be reborn and increase one's potential greatly. Just this pill alone costs 12,000 gold. This is the savings that a knight can only earn after 40 to 50 years. At the next moment, Fang Xingjian picked up a square box next to him. After opening it, there was a lump that was completely blue in color and looked like jelly. This is a moonlight stone that is formed from the condensation of moonlight radiation from 100,000 meters away in the sky. When used to forge weapons, it can produce an extremely low temperature of negative 150 degrees Celsius. This small piece is already sufficient to forge 2 weapons. Even if one were to consume it directly, it would give one an additional specialty, intermediate cold resistance. I spent 25,000 gold on it. Looking at the over 10 boxes in the hall, Fang Xingjian once again felt the importance of money. Putting aside how powerful the mystical prince were, just these heavenly and earthly treasures alone were enough to raise a conferred knight's abilities by a notch. When it came to cultivation, money was not the most crucial factor. However, it was true that having money could increase one's advantage. Robert asked, Xingjian, is everything here? Fang Xingjian nodded, took out a list, and passed it to Robert. He said, you can collect these things as well. If you don't have enough money, you can ask Ferdinand for more. The list naturally contained the materials needed for the second level of the mystical prince. However, when Robert saw the contents, his countenance changed, and he said, Xingjian, these things will cost at least 300,000 gold, right? We don't have that much money right now. Of course, Not all of Fang Xingjian's royalties would go to him. Ferdinand, Zhou Xingwen, and the Great Western Regional Academy would take about 10% of the royalties. Although there was still a lot of the remaining royalties, they had only earned a little over 200,000. Including the money earned from selling the books, it was still far from enough. Fang Xingjian shook his head. Keep it for now. There are so many academies in the empire. 10,000 for each one will be enough. Also, collect them separately and keep it a secret. Don't let anyone know that I'm the one who collected these things. Fang Xingjian did not wish for others to know about the mystical prince. As for the expenses for the mystical prince, Fang Xingjian knew that this was just the beginning. The further he progressed in the cultivation of the mystical prince, the more he would need to spend. It was definitely not something that his current income would be able to satisfy. However, no matter what, Fang Xingjian would use whatever money he had to cultivate first. After chasing Robert away, Fang Xingjian really did not leave his house for the rest of the days. While he cultivated his sword arts, he would slowly combine the materials for the mystical prince. He would either boil, mash, or boil them all together, turning them into the materials to inscribe the mystical prince. 3 days passed by, and the materials worth 100,000 gold were all melted together, turning into a bucket of sky blue, translucent liquid. It exuded a faint fluorescent light, like a flowing crystal. This liquid exuded a faint fragrance. Just by smelling it, Fang Xingjian's potential points increased by 10 points. This small item, which looked like fluorescent paint, had cost Fang Xingjian close to 100,000 gold. It was also the crux to cultivating the mystical prince. Next, Fang Xingjian dipped his finger into the dye and started to draw many graceful trajectories on his arms according to the rules of the mystical prince, forming many special diagrams. These diagrams continued to stack and combine, forming many formations. Even though it was only the first level of the mystical prince, it was still extremely complicated. Fang Xingjian carefully drew them on his arms. Densely packed diagrams and incantations that he could not understand could be seen everywhere. Even with Fang Xingjian's abilities, he had to draw for a total of 3 hours before his arms were completely covered in the fluorescent liquid. At the next moment, Fang Xingjian closed his eyes, and the prodigious astral divine powers waves came to a stop. He adjusted the waves in his body, changing them into the special waves recorded in the mystical prince. The ether particles in the surroundings seemed to seethe in an instant, and the waves grew increasingly stronger. The mystical prince on Fang Xingjian's arms emitted an increasingly bright fluorescent light. After reaching an extreme brightness, they disappeared. Is it done? Fang Xingjian opened his eyes and took a look. The mystical prince that he had drawn on his arms had disappeared, as if the liquid had seeped into the depths of his body. It's done so easily? Fang Xingjian even suspected that he had made a mistake. He shook his head and once again activated the prodigious astral divine powers waves, activating heaven's perception to see the effects. After activating the prodigious astral divine powers waves and then activating heaven's perception, Fang Xingjian's body trembled and his bones let out explosive sounds. He felt that the blood throughout his body was flowing wildly, and the ether particles in his body and outside his body were exchanging incessantly. The efficiency of his cultivation had increased by at least 1-fold. His ether synchronization rate had been cultivated to 30%. After reaching level 22, the increase in his ether synchronization rate had slowed down. However, the mystical prince had used special materials and methods to seep into his body, changing his body's material, as well as Fang Xingjian's life force fluctuations. This allowed his comprehension of ether particles to improve at a tremendous rate after circulating the waves. Although the various benefits provided by the materials were gone, the effect of the change in his aptitude was clearly even more heaven-defying. This feeling, it's as if my aptitude has been changed. My body is now able to receive and control the energy and information exchanged with ether particles more easily. Ether particles formed everything in the world. With the change in aptitude and the increase in one's comprehension of ether particles, one's comprehension of almost everything would be strengthened. The effect of the mystical prince to improve one's aptitude could be said to be heaven-defying. Sensing the state of his body, Feng Xingjian was confident that in at most half a month's time, his ether synchronization rate would increase from 34% to 40%. He would then level up and become a level 23 conferred knight. Therefore, Feng Xingjian continued to cultivate diligently, refusing to meet anyone. He continued to cultivate and synthesize the lightless sword every day while simultaneously tempering his attributes. When he was free, he would eat the delicacies sent by Zhou Xingwen. He felt that both the toughness of his body and the cultivation of his sword arts were improving at a tremendous rate. His comprehension of ether particles was also getting deeper and deeper. Finally, half a month passed by. In the middle of September, not only had he successfully synthesized the lightless sword into the phenomena sword formation and cultivated the prodigious demolition sword, but his ether synchronization rate had also reached 40%. He could now level up to level 23. Feng Xingjian opened his eyes, and his pupils turned pitch black in that instant. Through his heaven's perception, the entire world was extremely restless. He could sense that regardless of whether it was his body, every inch of his skin, every inch of his flesh or blood, or every part of all the physical substances in the world, they all seemed to be seething, enraged, and releasing their own waves. Is this the feeling of heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces with a 40% synchronization rate? The most basic force that forms all physical substances are the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces. Chapter 349. Feng Xingjian could vaguely sense every bit of flesh and blood in his body, all kinds of substances in the world, be it the earth, the walls, the furniture, the weapons, or the food. Feng Xingjian could sense that all matter was formed from extremely fine particles. He then sensed the restlessness, auras, and heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces that were transmitted between these particles, causing them to connect together and form matter. Molecules and electromagnetic force. Feng Xingjian did not dare to be certain. With his ether synchronization rate at 40%, he could only faintly sense the existence of the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces. He could not really control them down to the finest detail. However, no matter what, being able to sense the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces, which are the most basic components of matter, meant that Feng Xingjian had truly stepped into a new stage. Not only could he level up to level 23, but he could also borrow the power of thunderbolts to strengthen the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces in his flesh and blood, causing the basic units that formed up his body to become even more compact and sturdy. This would greatly increase his body's toughness and indirectly increase his body's functions. However, he could feel the endless restlessness in front of him. The entire world seemed to be jumping and trembling, and all matter was divided into countless minute components. If he focused his attention, he would be able to magnify and magnify again and again. This feeling made Feng Xingjian feel extremely uncomfortable. He felt that he could not see anything clearly, and everything was blurry. His brain was blocked by more and more information. This was obviously another heavenly barrier. Feng Xingjian had no choice but to spend an entire day getting used to this feeling before trying to filter the information. As for the newly synthesized prodigious demolition sword, it was another mysterious sword technique. It was different from the limitless sword formation, as the prodigious demolition sword existed for destruction, complete destruction, and everything in the world. Legend had it that the entire miracle world was created from the four forces of earth, water, fire, and wind. The thunderbolt sword technique, mountain shifting sword, aquatic sword formation, and lightless sword represented these forces. The prodigious demolition sword was derived from this. It condensed the powers of earth, water, fire, and wind, turning them into a destructive sword light that could annihilate everything in the world. Theoretically speaking, the amount of destruction Sword Gleam 1 could condense during a battle would determine the amount of matter one could annihilate. As a result, in addition to the fact that Fang Xingjian had been continuously tempering his attributes during this period of time, the information on his interface had become: name, Fang Xingjian, age, 17, occupation, Heavenly Sword Sovereign level, level 23 strength, 138 plus 10 agility, 230 plus 10 reaction, 127 endurance, 104 flexibility, 103 ether synchronization rate. 40% the attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated, due to perfect muscles, plus 10 in strength attribute. Techniques: boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 prodigious demolition sword, heaven's volition sword intense specialties, genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, high reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserk, supreme sword intent, sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense, heavenly sword imprint waves. Level 3 prodigious astral divine powers waves mental cultivation method. Level 6 universal sword dominance lunisolar potential. 30,000 points per day. 3 days later, the first stage of the sword arts killing techniques palace. 3 knights performed the thunderbolt sword technique at the same time, and there was a burning smell in the air. Densely packed electric sparks continued to light up and then extinguish in the hall. Streams of white thunderbolts struck out toward Fang Xingjian, who was in the center of the hall. They were like a great hammer, repeatedly tempering Fang Xingjian's body, hammering it back and forth like well-tempered steel. His body became increasingly denser and stronger. The ones performing the Thunderbolt sword technique were naturally the 2 students whom Fang Xingjian had encountered over a month ago when he was clearing the stage, as well as Duoluan, who was guarding the stage. Right now, Duoluan was performing his level 15 Thunderbolt sword technique to its limits. Every sword technique he performed was accompanied by incandescent thunderbolts. When each thunderbolt lit up, it was as if over 10,000 light bulbs had been lit up, burning the air and melting the ground. The thunderbolts struck onto Fang Xingjian's body, but they did not cause any ripples at all. This Fang Xingjian? My Thunderbolt sword technique summons thunderbolts, and even a superior divine weapon would be damaged by such an attack. To think that he is still fine even after removing a part of his heavenly abyss annihilation armor. How strong are the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces in his body? Duoluan had been invited by Fang Xingjian to perform the Thunderbolt sword technique, using thunderbolts to help Fang Xingjian cultivate his physical body. However, he did not know that Fang Xingjian had borrowed the power of the mystical prince to once again improve his aptitude, and he was now even more talented than before. Right now, Fang Xingjian's status was completely different from how it was in the past. He had already become a highly sought-after character, and Duoluan would naturally not underestimate him like he had when they first met. However, he had not expected that Fang Xingjian, who had just started cultivating his physical body's heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces, would be able to withstand it to such an extent. Meanwhile, Fang Xingjian was already immersed in the exhilaration of the rapid improvement of his physical body. He could feel that every particle in his body was jumping and dancing incessantly, exuding a feeling of joy. When his ether synchronization rate had reached 40%, he could faintly sense the countless microscopic particles that made up physical substances, as well as the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces between the particles. However, the feeling that 40% could provide was only a vague feeling. He was unable to control the particles or the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces down to the finest detail. However, just by attracting the thunderbolts that struck his body to strengthen the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces in his body and strengthen the power between the particles, causing his body to become increasingly denser and stronger. He would gradually become like Rakshasi, invulnerable to blades and spears, and impervious to fire and water. His physical body had already started to become extraordinary. Sensing that every hint of his flesh and blood was getting stronger, that the structural forces between the particles were getting stronger, that his body was becoming increasingly denser, and that his physical body's toughness was increasing, Feng Xingjian was feeling extremely carefree. Under the astonished gazes of the three conferred knights, Feng Xingjian leaped up, and an unrivaled attractive force came from his body. The many thunderbolts in the surroundings were like many small electric snakes, rapidly being absorbed into his body. In that instant, all the thunderbolts in the entire hall were wiped out. Feng Xingjian felt an intense feeling of fullness coming from his body. With a long bellow, his body trembled, and the explosive force that was unleashed compressed the air, creating a gust of strong gales. The gales struck against the walls, creating pitter-patter sounds. Sensing the improvement in his physical body, Feng Xingjian smiled and said, "I've already reached my limit today. Thank you, everyone." Duoluan smiled and said, "This is what we should do. Xingjian, you're now the pillar of our academy. With your abilities, you'll be able to participate in the national selection next year." Of course, he was just being polite. Just then, Robert rushed over from afar and said, "Xingjian, everything has been gathered." Feng Xingjian's eyes lit up. Half a month had passed, and the royalties for the rebirth sword technique had increased continuously, breaking through 400,000 gold coins. Robert had also finally gathered all the materials needed for the second level of the Mystical Prince. Thinking of the heaven-defying effects of the Mystical Prince improving one's aptitude, Feng Xingjian casually put on a set of training clothes and then headed to the sacred land with Robert. The first prince could attain the divine level at any moment now, and Feng Xingjian would naturally not let go of any means to increase his cultivation speed. Chapter 350. Feng Xingjian returned to the sacred land. Looking at the few boxes of materials he had obtained, the corners of his lips curled up into a satisfied smile. Ancient astral metal. It said that when the stars in the sky still existed, meteors landed on the ground and obtained the metal. It's extremely sturdy and hard to destroy after it's formed. This amount is already worth over 50,000 gold. The venom of a level 29 ferocious beast, the 9-colored spider queen. It can corrode a conferred knight's body directly and can be used to refine poison resistance medicine. It can give one a powerful poison resistance specialty. It's worth 20,000 gold. As he inspected the goods one by one, Feng Xingjian asked, "You bought them in secret and didn't reveal my name, right?" He did not plan on revealing the existence of the Mystical Prince and the list of materials. "Don't worry, Xingjian. I bought them in different places and in different amounts. I definitely didn't reveal your identity." And this, Feng Xingjian took out a box and revealed a strange stone that continued to emit white prints. This is the geomagnetic essence. It's buried deep underground for over 1,000 years and contains countless geomagnetic forces. After consuming it, ordinary blades and spears will find it hard to harm it. It's as if you've gone through heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism to temper your body in advance. It's also the most expensive item this time around, costing 90,000 gold? That's right. Robert looked at this item with some envy. If he could consume this geomagnetic essence, he would be able to become a top-notch knight expert. Even ordinary inferior divine weapons would only be able to pierce through his skin and not his muscles. However, Feng Xingjian, who had been inspecting the goods in satisfaction, frowned at the next moment. He exerted slight force in his hand that was holding onto the geomagnetic essence, and the strange stone shattered into over 10 pieces. Robert was shocked. "What's wrong, Xingjian? It's fake." A hint of killing intent flashed in Feng Xingjian's eyes. Someone has channeled geomagnetic forces into this item. Only a conferred knight expert would be able to do something like this. Oof, 90,000 gold. I've been scammed just like that. 90,000 gold. This amount of money was about what a prefectural academy would spend in a year. This amount of money could be used to buy a few hundred houses in the great western city. If it was used on a knight, he would be able to reach the pinnacle of a knight, and his attributes would be over 100 points or more. But now, he was cheated by someone else with a fake. How could Feng Xingjian not be angry? Robert was also taken aback. Afraid that Feng Xingjian would misunderstand him, he said, "I'll go look for the seller right now. They're in the ore market in the eastern suburbs of the great western city." Wait. Feng Xingjian stopped Robert and said, "What's the use of you going to the means of a conferred knight?" Robert lowered his head in shame. Feng Xingjian continued, "You hid your identity. They must have seen that you're not strong enough and have no background. That's why they tricked you. If you go there now, you might be backstabbed." Saying this, he could not help but frown. He still did not have any subordinates. The only conferred knight, Zhou Xingwen, had gone to the north to discuss the authorization for the rebirth sword technique. Right now, other than himself, there were no other conferred knights under him. Shaking his head, Feng Xingjian said calmly, "Forget it. I'll go with you." As he spoke, he grabbed Robert's neck with one hand and lifted him up slightly. The 9-feet-tall man was lifted up like a little chick. Feng Xingjian's footsteps flickered, and in the blink of an eye, he had left the sacred land and arrived outside the academy. Robert only felt that light and shadows were flashing before his eyes. When he stopped, he saw stars, and his heart was beating so fast that it was as if it was going to jump out. Feng Xingjian said calmly, "Show me the way." Robert's trembling fingers stretched out, and at the next moment, his body trembled violently once again. Then Feng Xingjian grabbed him by the neck and dashed out. Not long later, a bustling small town appeared before Feng Xingjian. The town was about over 10 kilometers away from the great western city. It was called Iron Ore Town and had been famous in the past for producing iron ores. Although the ores had dried up, the town had not weakened. Instead, it had become a famous ore market near the great western city. Under Robert's lead, Feng Xingjian arrived at the largest shop in the town. A shop assistant smiled and walked over, asking, "What are the two of you looking for?" "Our Golden Corner is the biggest material merchant in Iron Ore Town. We have everything from meteorites and heavenly dew to ordinary copper ores and silver ores." Robert said furiously, "I came here to buy geomagnetic essence 2 days ago. Have you forgotten that the goods you gave me were fake goods? Geomagnetic essence. That's 90,000 gold, and you've swallowed it just like that. You're really unscrupulous." Hearing Robert's words, the shop assistant's countenance immediately changed. The few men who had been chatting and laughing in the distance also turned their gazes over, their gazes filled with a strong sense of warning. Robert was wearing a knight attire, while Feng Xingjian had come out after his cultivation in the Killing Techniques Palace. He was only wearing a white training robe. Moreover, Feng Xingjian looked too young, so everyone thought that he was just Robert's follower. Following Robert's shouts, more and more people turned to look at him. When an old man saw Robert shouting, he walked over and tried to persuade him, "Sigh, young man, don't be so anxious. If there's anything, we can talk it out slowly. The Golden Corner isn't a place where you can create trouble," Robert said furiously. "They cheated me of 90,000 gold, and now I can't even shout a few words." The old man shook his head and sighed. "Sigh, youngsters these days can't even hold themselves back over small matters." "Small matters?" Robert pointed at the old man and scolded, "It's not your money, so of course you can pretend to be generous here. If you were to lose 90,000 gold, you'd die from anger." The old man was so angry that his body trembled. He pointed at Robert fiercely a few times, then turned to leave, wearing an expression that said, "This kid is unteachable." Seeing that more and more people were gathering around, the few men and assistant from the shop also walked over. They surrounded Robert and said to Feng Xingjian, "The two of you don't speak without thinking. The things that our shop sells are all genuine goods. We've never sold anything like you before. I think the two of you are here to swindle money. If you have something to say, go in and wait for our boss to come over to talk. Don't stay in the shop and affect our business." Seeing how the few assistants were glaring at him, as a knight, Robert was naturally not afraid. However, when Feng Xingjian said that the other party had a conferred knight backing them up, he could not help but look at Feng Xingjian with some hesitation. Feng Xingjian casually found a chair and sat down, saying coldly, "If you have anything to say, then let's talk here. Get your boss to come over in 5 minutes. If he's not here in 5 minutes, then he can forget about keeping the shop open." "Ha, what arrogance, lad." One of the assistants looked at Feng Xingjian, then looked at Robert and said, "We've given you face, but you don't want it. I advise you to scram. Otherwise, when our boss comes, things won't be so easy to talk to." They were only assistants, and their abilities were only at the level of knight apprentices. Naturally, they would not dare to touch a knight like Robert. However, seeing that Feng Xingjian was about the same age as them and was still so arrogant, two of the men immediately walked over and pushed Feng Xingjian. However, they had just stretched out their hands when two bangs rang out, and the two men were sent flying. They rolled on the ground and let out agonizing cries. Chapter 351. Bones. My bones are all shattered. The moment Feng Xingjian made his move, everyone present gasped in astonishment. How dare he? To think that he dares to make a move here. There's going to be a good show to watch. Seeing that Feng Xingjian had crippled the two men with just 2 kicks, all the shop assistants stopped making a move. However, their gazes toward Feng Xingjian and Robert were as if they were looking at 2 dead men. The old man who had tried to persuade them earlier shook his head and said, "Sigh, youngsters these days are full of youthful vigor. They don't even know how to be considerate of others. Creating trouble at someone else's shop. Aren't they just trying to ruin their livelihood?" When Robert saw that Feng Xingjian was frowning slightly, he immediately stood up and scolded, "Humph, what a shameless old man. Humph, what a shameless old thing. Since when is it your turn to be generous with our money? You're not going to do it when we ask you to scram?" With that, he activated his reduced force field and slapped the old man across the air, causing his mouth to be filled with blood. He then hid behind the crowd dejectedly, as if he wanted to watch Feng Xingjian and the others put on a good show. On the other side, one of the shop assistants left the shop. It was obvious that he had gone to deliver the news. The crowd grew larger and larger, all of them talking at the same time as if they were watching a show. "Gus is the one who opened the gold essence horn. I heard that her elder brother is a conferred knight. Sigh, the two of you had better leave quickly. Gus herself is a top-notch knight. Once she comes, you won't be able to leave. How can money be more important than your life? You guys too. Didn't you ask about the shop's background before you bought things?" Clearly, the gold essence horn had been running amok in Iron Ore Town for quite some time. The shop owner, Gus, relied on her elder brother's influence and often bullied some customers, swindling and cheating them. However, she was also very observant. She would not take the initiative to offend those who had a bit of a background. This time, it was because he saw that Robert was an unfamiliar face and wasn't a local. After chatting with him for a while, he didn't seem to have any background, so he took action. Moreover, it was not the first or second time that Feng Xingjian had made counterfeits. If the other party did not have a conferred knight to check with their heaven's perception, they would not be able to tell. She had made use of this opportunity to embezzle quite a few sums of money. Even though there were a few times when something had happened, Feng Xingjian had managed to suppress it. From then on, she had become increasingly unbridled. Not long after, a total of 5 knights wielding clubs and 40 to 50 acolytes behind them rushed over. As soon as they arrived, they scared off the onlookers and surrounded Feng, Xingjian, and Robert. The person in the lead was the manager, Gus. She was a plump woman who was more than 9 meters tall and had a fierce-looking face. When she saw Feng, Xingjian, and Robert, she had a fierce look on her face. However, after living in Iron Ore Town for so many years, she had a good eye for people. Although Feng Xingjian looked ridiculously young, his calmness was definitely not fake. Therefore, she probed, "The two of you, there must be some misunderstanding regarding the geomagnetic essence. If there's any problem, let's go in and talk about it." Fang Xingjian threw a cold glance toward the knights behind Gus and said calmly, "Let's talk here. Since you've cheated me of 90,000, you should return me 120,000. It was true that the great western city was much more prosperous than cursed in the past. There were already conferred knights looking after a single mining center, and 5 knights had been casually deployed." When Gus heard Fang Xingjian's extremely tough tone, her brows twitched slightly, and there seemed to be killing intent in her eyes. However, she held it in and first reported her background. "This geomagnetic essence was brought over by my elder brother from the Bureau of Mines in the Great Western region. He's the deputy chief of the Bureau of Mines, so he shouldn't have gotten it wrong. Where are you from? Don't tell me you've made a mistake in your appraisal. This geomagnetic essence is something that only conferred knights can tell." She was trying to sound out Fang Xingjian's background while reporting her background. However, Fang Xingjian ignored the other party's probing and said directly, "I'll wait here. I'll give you half an hour's time. When the time is up, if I don't see the money, I'll tear down your shop and use the items in your shop to repay the debt." Sensing that Fang Xingjian was not going to reveal his identity at all, and that his tone was also aggressive and tough, Gus, the fat lady, did not dare to make a move. In her impression, those who would dare to speak like this were all the second generations of great aristocrats in the great western city. Only they would be so arrogant and domineering. Just then, another young man walked out from behind Gus. This young man had brown curly hair, and his gaze toward Fang Xingjian was filled with discomfort. He said, "Friend, it's enough to stop here. Don't go overboard." This young man's name was Rosalind, and his father was the assistant of the Great Western Region's governor. He was also a conferred knight and a close subordinate of Governor Devitt. His rank was not high, but no one in the entire Great Western Region dared to look down on him. After all, who would dare to offend him if he could speak next to the top person in the Great Western Region? Because of this, Rosalind felt very good about himself. Today, he had been invited to the Iron Ore Town by Gus, his former classmate. Rosalind had wanted to pull this young master along to do some ores business together. Right now, he had also been pulled over by Gus to stand on her side. "I'm Rosalind, Gus' friend. It's really too much to gather the money within half an hour. I think it's better that we go in and discuss this slowly. Geomagnetic essence is good stuff, but if we can't appraise it, it might be seen as a fake. Why don't you guys bring it over, and we'll let you take a look." Rosalind had only come out to say a few words of fairness and to secretly reveal his identity. However, Fang Xingjian threw him a glance and said calmly, "You're going to shoulder the 120,000 you want on his behalf? If you're not, then you don't have a right to speak here." With that, Rosalind's countenance turned grim. As the son of the governor's assistant, other than those top-notch characters in the Great Western Region, when had he ever been disgraced like this? His profligate nature rose up, and he ignored Gus' harsh words and let out a cold snort. "Brat, I've really given you some face, but you really think that you're someone important? Have you looked into the background of this Iron Ore Town? How dare you come here to create trouble?" Fang Xingjian could not be bothered with him. He slapped down across space, slapping Rosalind onto the ground as if he was swatting a fly. Rosalind sprawled on the ground in a human shape. He wanted to raise his head, but Fang Xingjian stomped down on his head, pressing it into the muddy water. Looking at Rosalind's reddened eyes and face, Gus let out a sigh inwardly. This was a great humiliation and a feud that would not end until one of them was dead. In her eyes, Rosalind was too rash, and the young man opposite him was even more vicious. At this moment, she slightly regretted bringing Rosalind along to hold the fort. Rosalind struggled crazily, punching out at the leg that was stepping on his head. However, he felt that Fang Xingjian's leg was like a heavenly pillar, not reacting at all. Instead, there were loud banging sounds, causing his hands to be in pain. Fang Xingjian's strength was extremely heavy, causing him to be unable to even move his head. He bellowed furiously, "Gus, are you just going to watch like this?" A hint of hesitation flashed on Gus' fierce face, and her eyes narrowed like a crocodile's. She knew that it was time for her to choose a side. She had seen all the top-notch second generations in the great western city, but there was definitely no one with a face like Fang Xingjian's. Rosalind's father was the governor's assistant, and it could be said that he was second only to the governor. Moreover, if she did not save Rosalind, Feng Xingjian would not be grateful to her. On the contrary, Rosalind would hate her as well. It seemed that there was nothing more to say. Gus waved her hand and said, "All of you attack. How dare you come to our golden corner to create trouble? Break their legs." Chapter 352. Robert looked at the three knights charging toward him and heaved a sigh of relief. The other party's abilities might not be a match for his in a one-on-one fight, but if the three of them were to come at him together, they would be able to suppress him. At the thought of this, he felt increasingly thankful that he had come with Feng Xingjian. If he had come alone, not only would he not be able to get back the 90,000 gold, but he would also be beaten up badly. Feng Xingjian threw a cold glance at the three knights charging toward him and punched out across space. It was clearly a fist force, but under the conversion of his sword bones, it was turned into sword force. It was as if a long sword was slashing across the air, cutting through the atmosphere and creating 3 shock waves in the air, which then turned into 3 gushes of sword cheese. A series of stifled grunts and agonizing cries rang out, and the 3 knights who had charged toward him fell to the ground with broken bones. A look of astonishment flashed on the fierce-looking Gus face. Feng Xingjian had only attacked across space, yet he was able to cause 3 knights to fall to the ground with serious injuries. His abilities were truly unfathomable. Moreover, his means were very ordinary, merely forming shock waves by attacking air currents across space. This made it even more impossible for her to tell Feng Xingjian's identity and background. Gus threw a fierce glance at Feng Xingjian. However, the situation was not in her favor. Although her eyes were filled with hatred and humiliation, she still bent down and asked once again, "Who on earth are you? Even if I want to gather the money, I can't possibly not know your name, right?" The strongest emotions in Feng Xingjian's heart were fury and hatred. Usually, he would be suppressed and channeled by his mental cultivation method, making others feel that he was cold and unapproachable. However, the moment he erupted, it would be like the battle in the Prefectural Academy and when he was dealing with Sally. He was extremely violent. This time around, Feng Xingjian had scammed him of 90,000 gold, dragging him down at such a critical juncture. The negative emotions in his heart burned even more fiercely. Hearing Gus' words, Feng Xingjian threw her a sideways glance and said coldly, "Do you think you're worthy of asking about my identity? Gather the money within half an hour. Otherwise, you can forget about opening your shop. Bring out whatever backing you have and whatever means you have. I'll be right here." When Feng Xingjian said this and was unwilling to reveal his identity, Gus knew that this young man would definitely not be willing to let things slide. Moreover, she felt that she had already given Feng Xingjian enough face, yet he kept on pressuring her. The fury in her heart grew increasingly greater as she shouted, "You're really impressive." This iron ore town is under the direct jurisdiction of the Great Western Region's Bureau of Mines. It's best that you don't bring trouble to your clan. Even now, Gus still vaguely felt that the other party should be some great nobleman from out of town, and that there was someone in his family with a high position and authority, which was why he dared to be so arrogant and despotic. Gus still felt that he had to be some great aristocratic clan from, of his. Of Fong of Gu. She of him of him of. This gush of power was not very strong, but with the support of the unparalleled sword intent, it was extremely ingenious. It reached Gus' ears directly and broke her balance, causing her to stumble and tumble to the ground. She exerted strength in her legs, but her ears and cerebellum had been injured from the earlier impact, and she was unable to get up for a long time. Robert threw a careful glance at Feng Xingjian. Ever since he had gotten to know Feng Xingjian in the Prefectural Academy, he knew that Feng Xingjian was someone who was cold on the outside but warm on the inside. Usually, he appeared to be cold, but once he lost his temper, it would be like a volcanic eruption. Back when he was still a knight, He had dared to abduct Countess right in front of Cursed Academy's headmaster. Now that Feng Xingjian had become a conferred knight, his methods were naturally even more ruthless. Feng Xingjian had not reported his name even now. It was clear that he was determined to teach Gus and the person behind her a lesson. Seeing that Gus was swaying and unable to get up, Feng Xingjian said calmly, "You only have 27 minutes left." Gus' expression was one of agony, and she only managed to get up after a long time. She opened her mouth and was about to scold Feng Xingjian, but she was stopped by Feng Xingjian's cold gaze. "If you say another word, I'll take your life." Gus' face was flushed red, and she clenched her fists tightly. However, she could only keep the words she wanted to say in her heart. She turned and left, not daring to take another look at Feng Xingjian. Rose Slim, who was under Feng Xingjian's feet, shouted, "Lad, do you dare to let me go? Who can you get? Conferred knights. Oh, you're scared." However, Rose Slim felt his face relax, and he was able to stand up. He quickly rolled on the ground and stood up, looking in Feng Xingjian's direction. "Lad, if you have the guts, then don't leave. Wait here." Feng Xingjian smiled, swept out with his sword fingers, and sword cheese seethed. Rose Slim let out an astonished cry and immediately retreated with all his might. All the hair on his body stood up, and he felt that he had never run so fast in his entire life. In the blink of an eye, he had already moved 100 meters away. Sensing that his body was not injured, Rose Slim grinned and looked at Feng Xingjian, saying, "Lad, just you wait. You're dead meat. You're dead meat this time around. When I come back, I'll make you beg me on your knees." Halfway through his words, lightning flashed in the air. Rose Slim let out an agonizing cry and retreated over 10 steps before coming to a stop. However, he stared at Feng Xingjian's palm. In Feng Xingjian's palm, there was a thumb emitting hints of cold air, lying there quietly. Rose Slim lowered his head abruptly and looked at his right hand. However, he discovered that his thumb had been cut off by the low-temperature ether sword ripples and then frozen. The effects of the freezing caused him to not bleed, nor did he feel any pain. Feng Xingjian said calmly, "If you take it back within an hour, it can still be used. I'll wait for you here. Hurry up and get someone to come." Rose Slim's face trembled, and his eyes were filled with crazed, killing intent. His thumb had been cut off, and he did not have the ability to regenerate. Unless he could advance to become a conferred knight, he would never be able to use his right hand to wield a weapon again. "Lad, you're dead meat. You're really dead meat. You've offended someone you can't afford to offend." After saying that, Rose Slim dashed away at full speed, his heart filled with burning, killing intent. He must make that arrogant lad kneel down and beg him before he killed him. Robert looked at Feng Xingjian. He knew that if Feng Xingjian were to reveal his identity directly or perform the means of a conferred knight, it would be impossible for Rose Slim to maintain his current attitude. He could not help but say, "Xingjian, there's no need to make such a big fuss, right?" However, Feng Xingjian closed his eyes. "Since they've taken my money, they'll naturally have to spit it out with interest. I don't have the time to drag things out with them." Feng Xingjian might be able to use his name to pressure them, but that would only be based on personal relationships. God knew how long they would continue to talk, and there might even be people who would come to plead for him. He might as well cut the Gordian knot, not revealing his identity or personal relationships, and let them know of his determination. This would prevent them from having any wishful thinking. The speed of knights or conferred knights was still very fast. Within a short span of 20 minutes, there were already 2 groups of people charging over. Beside Gus was a middle-aged man with slightly white hair and a strong physique. It was her elder brother, Daniel, the deputy chief of the Bureau of Mines in the Great Western region. The group of people charging in front of them were even more aggressive. Layers of reduced force fields were unleashed without any reservations, and they went on a rampage, causing people to be thrown off their feet. A total of 2 conferred knights surrounded Feng Xingjian the moment they arrived. These are the Flowing Water Dojo's Duolin and Duolong brothers. I heard that the Flowing Water Dojo has been sucking up to the governor's assistant for the sake of the Knight's Handbook. It seems that they're going to stand up for Roslim this time around. Sigh, the alchemy shop had offended the people from the Flowing Water Dojo. In the end, there was a huge fire, and all 22 members of the shop were burnt to death. These two brothers are vicious and merciless. That lad is going to be in for it. Roslim walked over with a hideous smile, looked at Fong Xingjian, and said, "Lad, my father is Krell, the governor's assistant from the Great Western region. If you kneel down and beg for mercy, I can still spare your life." When he had been beaten up earlier, he had thought that the other party had only done so because they did not know his identity. He had held back until now to reveal his father's name because he was afraid that Fong Xingjian would escape. Behind him, Gus' elder brother, Daniel, shook his head and thought to himself, Krell can be considered an outstanding talent of his generation. To think that he would have such a son. As he thought of this, he saw Fong Xingjian. However, his countenance changed, and over 10 different emotions flashed in his eyes. His heart sank. To think that it's him? Damn it, Gus. How did she end up offending this malefic? Chapter 353. Deputy Chief Daniel's countenance changed several times. He had participated in the arbitration and had seen Fong Xingjian before. He thought of the many rumors about Fong Xingjian. Even the First Prince and Sword Saint Sasa could not do anything to him, and there were still so many amazing people supporting him. Putting aside a powerful person like the Holy Orison, just James and the Great Western Region's Governor Victor would be able to toy with him, the Deputy Chief of the Bureau of Mines, to death. Thinking of this, he glared fiercely at Gus, causing her to shudder in fear. She was baffled, and the muscles on her face twitched. She did not know what had happened. Deputy Chief Daniel had wanted to remind Dylan, Roslim, and the others, but after some thought, he decided not to do so. This time around, it was Gus who had lied to Fong Xingjian. Rather than trying to persuade him now, it would be better to let Roslim and the others attract more of his wrath. Moreover, the Dwelluin and Dwelluin brothers had committed all sorts of evils, raping and killing women and exterminating entire clans. They had even dared to rebut Fong Xingjian with their abilities. This was a good opportunity to deal with them. Fong Xingjian threw a glance toward the Dwelluin and Dwelluin brothers and said, "The two of you aren't the Empire's Confer Knights, right? What faction are you from?" The Dwelluin and Dwelluin brothers had muscles all over their bodies and were bald. They looked like simple-minded people with well-developed limbs. However, in reality, the two of them had been practicing martial arts since young. Due to their outstanding talent and pureness, they had been advancing bravely and diligently. They had also gathered all the resources in the Flowing Water Dojo, allowing them to attain a breakthrough to the realm of heaven's perception and successfully go through the job transition in the Flowing Water Dojo's sacred land, becoming the only two conferred knights. However, with their temperament, talent, and the resources in the Flowing Water Dojo, their current second transition level 22 was already their limit. Despite this, second transition level 22 was already rare in the world. Even in the Great Western City, it was enough for them to be domineering, bullying, and killing countless commoners. The Flowing Water Dojo, which they were in, had also produced conferred knights in the past. However, it had fallen into decline later on, and they had even lost the right to distribute the Knight's Handbook. Now that they had produced two geniuses, they naturally continued to expand and occupy their territory. It was only then that they wanted to obtain the right to distribute the Knight's Handbook once again in order to increase their reputation and expand their dojo. The Knight's Handbook was filled with the latest and most cutting-edge information of the Empire's martial path. Naturally, not every faction, dojo, or academy had the right to enjoy it. Not only did they have to pay the fees every year, but they also had to obtain the qualifications of the association. This was equivalent to an industry standard set by the Knight Association, dominating all the academies and factions in the Empire. It was the leader of the entire industry, taking whatever it wanted. The Flowing Water Dojo had not obtained the Knight's Handbook for many years, which meant that they had fallen behind a lot in terms of their techniques and martial techniques. Now that they had two geniuses who had become conferred knights, they naturally had to think of ways to regain their rights. One of the ways they had thought of was to become the governor's assistant. Hearing Fang Xingjian's question, Duoluan shouted, "That's right. We're Duoluan and Duolong from the Flowing Water Dojo." However, Roslim was already feeling impatient. He said, "Why are you wasting your breath on him? Snatch my finger back and then break his limbs. I'll make it so that he won't be able to pass for 3 days and 3 nights." Fang Xingjian threw a glance at Duolin and Duolong and said, "You guys want to attack the Empire's knights?" Duoluan and Duolong exchanged a glance. Usually, killing a commoner was as easy as killing a chicken. It would not be difficult for them to wipe out a small clan. When they lacked money, they would turn into bandits the moment they covered their faces. They had even attacked aristocrats before. However, if this guy was really a knight, then it would still be troublesome if they were to attack him on the streets. Therefore, Duoluan twisted his neck, and killing intent burst forth from all over his body. He took 3 light steps forward, causing the earth to tremble. The houses in the surroundings shook as if the earth was quaking and the mountains were swaying. Powder kept on falling down. Duoluan laughed savagely and said, "Brat, it's better if you surrender yourself. If we take action, it'll be painful." His series of actions showed that he wanted to use the prowess of a second transition expert to force Fang Xingjian. Fang Xingjian looked at them coldly and said, "I'll kill whoever makes a move." Seeing how fearless Fang Xingjian was, even Duoluan and Duolong hesitated for a moment. However, Roslim's mind was already filled with fury. He stared at his finger and shouted, "What are you guys hesitating for? Take action. Quickly take action. I'll take responsibility for everything. I'll also agree to everything you guys said earlier." Duoluan and Duolong nodded secretly, thinking that with Roslim's father supporting them, they should be fine. Therefore, Duoluan laughed savagely and said, "Brat, it's too late for you to surrender now. You can only blame yourself for offending someone you shouldn't have." Deputy Chief Daniel frowned slightly and grabbed hold of Gus, who wanted to stop the situation from worsening. Gus looked at Daniel, puzzled. Daniel shook his head slightly and sent a message. Let them take the lead and attract more firepower. Thinking of this, he secretly rejoiced. Thankfully, he knew of Fang Xingjian's identity and had seen his appearance. Now, by letting the Duoluan brothers and Roslim take the lead and attract the firepower and aggro, his younger sister, Gus, will be able to avoid a lot of trouble. As Duoluan spoke, he struck out with a punch, sending layers of stacking powers sweeping out through the reduced force field. In his opinion, a conferred knight's absolute strength would be enough to suppress Fang Xingjian. However, the moment he made his move, Fang Xingjian's body flashed slightly, and there seemed to be a stream of electricity sweeping past in the air. A sword attack that was as fast as lightning flashed and disappeared in a flash. Everyone present only saw a flash of light, followed by darkness. Fang Xingjian had already appeared behind Duoluan. The latter's body was stiff and unmoving, but his head was already held in Fang Xingjian's hand. "Elder brother," Duoluan let out an enraged bellow, and the muscles throughout his body swelled up rapidly as he performed his job's technique, Berserk Battle God. This transformation technique, which required 150 flexibility points to perform, caused all of his 5-dimensional attributes to instantly increase to over 160 points. Although Fang Xingjian had displayed the ability to instantly kill his elder brother, how could Duoluan still have so many considerations when he saw his own brother die before him? In that instant, after turning into a small giant, he slashed out with both hands, activating the killing technique Vacuum Blade, wanting to slash out over 1,000 vacuum slashes. The air currents in the surroundings seethed, and everyone felt as if their faces had been slashed by blades. If he were to use it, the area within a 100-meter radius would probably become a sea of blood and mountains of corpses. In his fury, Duoluan could no longer care about anything else. Therefore, Fang Xingjian's body flashed once again, and Duoluan's 4 limbs were slashed apart. As the speed of the slashes was too fast, Duoluan's torso even stopped in midair for an instant. Then fresh blood spurted out from the wounds on his 4 limbs, and he fell into a pool of blood on the ground. He struggled crazily and cried out agonizingly. It did not take long before he gradually lost all signs of life. With such a great amount of blood loss, no matter how strong his vitality was, he would not be able to hold on for long. With such a bloody conflict suddenly erupting, the crowd gasped and retreated. Roslim only felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had suddenly entered an ice cellar. To be able to kill 2 level 22 conferred knights in an instant. How terrifying was his ability? He immediately wanted to escape, but after taking a few steps back, he realized that his body seemed to have bumped into a mountain. When he turned back, he saw that Gus' elder brother, Daniel, had already grabbed him by the neck as if he was grabbing a little chick. Roslim shouted loudly, Daniel? Why are you grabbing me? Quick, kill that lad. He killed Dwoluin and Dwoluin. For a commoner to attack the Empire's conferred knights, he deserves to die, Daniel said coldly. Roslim looked at the cold-looking Daniel in a daze. This was the first time he had seen Daniel look at him with such a gaze. Gus looked at this scene in astonishment. Her elder brother, Daniel, also knew of Roslim and had even encouraged her to interact more with this son of the governor's assistant and build a good relationship with him. However, right now, Daniel's face was cold, and there was no sign of the gentleness she usually saw. Fang Xingjian looked over and said, You know me? Daniel nodded and said, I've seen Mr. Fang's looks during the arbitration, and I've always admired you. I didn't expect to meet you under such circumstances. I'll prepare the compensation, and I'll also give Mr. an explanation for the culprit. Mr. Fang. Gus looked at Fang Xingjian and thought of his age, his ability to defeat a conferred knight, and how he had addressed him as Mr. Fang. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck her mind. A 17-year-old conferred knight. Fang Xingjian? Gus felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured over her head. Thinking of what Daniel had done earlier, she immediately understood. My elder brother sold Roslim out? Although Roslim was a profligate son, he was still her friend and classmate. Seeing how her elder brother had sold him out just like that, she suddenly felt extremely sorrowful. Fang Xingjian let out a cold snort. Now that the other party knew his identity and had lowered his stance, Fang Xingjian could not be bothered to pursue the matter further. Fang Xingjian had just killed 2 second transition experts, so he turned to leave. Transfer 30,000 gold directly to my account. As for the remaining 90,000 gold, find me a piece of geomagnetic essence. Chapter 354. Seeing that Fang Xingjian had disappeared, Robert quickly left as well. Gus said in a daze, Brother, that's Fang Xingjian? That's right. Other than him, is there any other young man in the great western city who could be so arrogant? Daniel looked at the surrounding crowd and said coldly, Follow me to the shop first. He then threw a glance at Dwoluin and Dwalong's corpses and said, Get someone to collect their corpses and send them to the regional academy for Fang Xingjian. Gus hesitated for a moment before asking, Don't we need to give them to the Flowing Water Dojo? After all, they're from the Flowing Water Dojo. Flowing Water Dojo? Do you think that they'll be able to continue operating after attacking the Empire's conferred knights? Daniel put down Roslim and said, You should look for your father to think of a solution. With that, he turned and left with Gus, leaving Roslim to mumble in a daze. Fang Xingjian? Which Fang Xingjian? The moment they entered the depths of the shop, Daniel turned and kicked Gus in the stomach. With a bang, Gus was sent flying, slamming into the wall, and spurting out a large mouthful of blood. Fresh blood then flowed out from the corners of her lips. Brother. Gus lifted her head and looked at Daniel. She was about to flare up, but his gaze, which was filled with killing intent, caused her to feel a chill down her spine. She was unable to say anything. Daniel suppressed his anger and scolded. Look at what you've done. That's Fang Xingjian, a very popular person in the Great Western region. With just a single word from him, he'll be able to get rid of your elder brother, me, the deputy chief. But But I didn't know who he was. Then don't you know how to use your brain? Is someone who can pay 90,000 gold to buy the geomagnetic essence someone you can casually scam? The more Daniel spoke, the angrier he got. Prepare the 90,000 gold immediately. You haven't spent it yet, right? Gus cursed in her heart. Isn't it all because of you? However, when faced with the enraged Daniel, she naturally did not dare to say anything. Seeing Gus shake her head, Daniel exhaled and said, "Spit out the money and buy a geomagnetic essence to send to Fong Xingjian." He then glared at Gus. "Don't play any more tricks this time around." "I'm not a fool," the manager Gus sighed. "Do you have 30,000 gold? If you don't have it, you can pay from me. When the time comes, you can personally take the geomagnetic essence to apologize. I'll go with you. Also, hand over those lads who attacked just now." Gus' eyes widened in disbelief. "Max and the others? But they've been with me for almost 10 years. You think Fong Xingjian is easy to talk to? They attacked him, didn't they?" Daniel turned to look at her. The first person who offended Fong Xingjian was Kaunitz. He's the only son of an aristocrat in Cursed. His corpse is yet to be found. When Fong Xingjian was still a knight, he charged into the Western Front alone and killed over 10 Garcia's great warriors. Is Sword Saint Sasa powerful? No one has seen him for half a month. Don't think that he looks like a young man. This guy is very vicious. Gus lowered her head and said hesitantly, "Can we just hand over 2 of them? Not even one less. Who knows if he'll remember you, just because of 1 or 2 of them." He reached the second transition and level 23 in less than a year and a half. If he suddenly remembers this matter 2 or 3 years later and still feels displeased, do you think that I, your brother, will be able to stop him? Gus clenched her fists tightly, trembling incessantly. Daniel was still saying, "Don't bother about the matters in Iron Town. After apologizing, go back to your hometown in the Southern Flame region." Gus lifted her head abruptly. "Brother, this is the result of over 10 years of hard work. I can't just go back like this." Another kick landed on Gus' face, causing her already plump head to be covered in blood. "It's not up to you. Go back and cultivate well. Don't come back until you become a conferred knight. Also, you're not allowed to tell father and grandfather about this. Let me tell you, if you dare to let father and grandfather stand up for you, I'll be the first to kill you. If you let them deal with Fong Xingjian, you won't be taking revenge. You'll be harming them." Gus said indignantly, "Brother, is Fong Xingjian really that terrifying?" Daniel shook his head. "You're not a conferred knight, so you won't understand. The Pantheon Monument, the Killing Techniques Palace, the Rebirth Sword Technique. Fong Xingjian's talent isn't just terrifying." Roslim returned home in a daze. However, when he opened the door, he saw his father sitting on a chair in the hall, glaring at him. He smiled guiltily. "Father, how did you find the time to come back? If I hadn't come back, I wouldn't even know how I died." Roslim's father stood up and said with an extremely hoarse voice, "You're getting better and better. You colluded with a wild knight from the Flowing Water Dojo to kill an Empire's conferred knight in front of a few hundred people. In a few years' time, will you even learn? Cultivate. All. Dare. Fight. Do." The last few words were spoken through clenched teeth. Roslim shivered, stood up straight, and said, "Father, I really didn't know that he was Fong Xingjian. As a profligate son, he had not known who Fong Xingjian was at the start. It was only after he got someone to ask around that he found out that Fong Xingjian was the inventor of the Rebirth Sword technique that had been extremely popular for the past half a month or so, as well as the current regional champion. You don't know? Just because you don't know, you can get the people from the Flowing Water Dojo to help you fight? Help you kill? Ha! You want someone to stay alive for 3 days and 3 nights. Do you really think that your father's position is too stable?" Roslim gulped and said, "I was just saying those words out of anger. Moreover, that Fong Xingjian is still a student of the regional academy. At most, father, you can just give him some money and I'll just apologize to him." "Apologize? Who do you think you are? Do you think that you're so thick-skinned that he'll accept your apology?" A vicious gleam flashed in Roslim's father's eyes. However, when he saw Roslim, who was as frightened as a little rabbit. He eventually shook his head. Thinking of how he had been gathering information, compromising, discussing, and asking for help for the past few hours, he seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant. He had already put in a lot of effort just to get the Flowing Water Dojo to admit their guilt and explain that Dwin and Duolong had attacked the Empire's conferred knight on their own. Usually, it would be a piece of cake for him to get them to admit their guilt. However, if he wanted them to admit their guilt, it would mean that he wanted to wipe out the Flowing Water Dojo completely. Attacking the Empire's conferred knight was not a small crime. This caused the Flowing Water Dojo to retaliate crazily. It took Roslim's father a lot of effort to contact all of his connections. He then asked Fong Xinjian to exchange for his son's thumb. He did not have a direct relationship with Fong Xinjian, so he had gone through a few middlemen and depleted a lot of resources and connections. Therefore, when faced with other people's attacks and those who were aiming at his position, he felt a little powerless. He then looked at Roslim's right hand, which had been bandaged up, and shook his head helplessly. Once again, a hint of affection flashed in his eyes as he pointed to the square box on the table and said, "That's your finger. My friend will be here soon. He has healing abilities. You just have to cooperate with him, and you'll be able to recover your hand after a year or so." Roslim ran up excitedly, opened the box, and saw that the finger which had been sliced off by Fong Xinjian was lying there in perfect condition. He smiled and looked at his father, saying, "Father, you've settled it?" "Settled?" Roslim's father smiled bitterly. "I'm just an assistant. What can I settle? Go and make some preparations." With that, Roslim's father stood up and walked out slowly. "We'll be moving to Gem City in a few days' time." Gem City? Doesn't that mean that we're going to the border of the Great Western region? I heard that it's a barren land, and there isn't even a prefectural academy there. Roslim looked at his father in astonishment. He felt that his father's back view had suddenly become shorter. There was no sign of his usual high spirits. Right now, he looked just like a little old man. He suddenly realized that his father must have paid a great price for this finger of his. He immediately chased after him and shouted, "Father, I don't want this finger anymore. Without a thumb, I can still practice fist and palm techniques. Return it." Roslim's father turned and smiled bitterly, stroking Roslim's head. "There are so many people eyeing your father's position. What's the use of returning it? I'll be very happy that you've remembered this and grown." Looking at his father's aged face, Roslim lowered his head, and there seemed to be tears in his eyes. This was when he truly realized that he had brought great trouble to his father. He had even changed the future of his father and the entire clan. At this moment, Roslim's eyes were filled with extreme regret and guilt. Chapter 355. After settling the matters in Iron or Town, Fong Xinjian continued to walk on the streets of the Great Western City. Robert carefully followed behind Fong Xinjian. Although Fong Xinjian appeared to be fine, Robert could sense that he was not in a good mood. This was indeed the case. Fong Xinjian took a look at his own emotions, and the negative emotions which had been suppressed in the depths of his mind gushed forth with the earlier outburst. Although he felt much better after teaching Daniel a lesson, Daniel's subsequent humility made it impossible for Fong Xinjian to pursue the matter further. However, the earlier conflict had allowed his mental cultivation method to improve once again. Seeing that his mental cultivation method had improved tremendously, if this were to happen over 10 more times, he might just be able to level up. Fong Xinjian walked around the streets of the Great Western City, using his heaven's perception to receive light waves and sound waves. He continued to search for people whom he could kill to quell his anger and improve his mental cultivation method. However, Governor Devitt was personally in charge of the Great Western City, so how could he possibly encounter any incidents? Fong Xinjian walked one round, but was still unable to find his target. He only felt that the air in his chest was getting increasingly hot. Just then, he suddenly sniffed hard. What a fragrant smell. What's this? Taking a whiff of this fragrance, Fong Xinjian felt that the restlessness in his body seemed to have eased up a little. Therefore, he followed the fragrance, and after a long series of turns, he arrived at a restaurant in a small alley. This was a small shop that looked a little old. However, the fragrance was getting increasingly stronger. It was the smell of roasted meat. Fang Xingjian had eaten a lot of roasted meat before, but this was the first time he had eaten one that smelled so good. Fang Xingjian opened the door and walked in. He saw that the small shop was already filled with people. As Fang Xingjian entered, many people turned to look at him. Most of them only threw a glance at Fang Xingjian before turning their gazes to Robert, who was behind Fang Xingjian. After all, Fang Xingjian looked like an ordinary, fair-skinned young man, while Robert was wearing a knight's attire. Seeing Robert following behind Fang Xingjian like a follower, most people thought that this young man must be a rich second-generation nobleman. Fang Xingjian casually found a seat and sat down. The waiter came over and asked, "Sir, what would you like to eat?" Fang Xingjian sniffed and asked, "Is this the smell of barbecue?" "Yeah." The waiter smiled and pointed to the corner of the hall, where someone was barbecuing. "Our Vulcan barbecue is very famous. Would you like to try it, sir?" Fang Xingjian said casually, "Give us 10 caddies first, and give us 2 cups of water." There were too many cultivators in Miracle World, and knights could be seen every day in the Great Western region. Although the 10 caddies that Fang Xingjian had mentioned was a lot, the waiter was clearly used to it. After ordering the barbecue, he looked toward the corner of the hall and saw a golden-haired young lady fiddling with the barbecue. The young lady's golden hair was tied into a ponytail, and she was wearing a white chef's attire. Her hands were very fast, and she single-handedly cut up the meat, added the ingredients, and barbecued it. Her eyebrows were thin and long, and they were squeezed together. Her eyes were fixed on the heat of the barbecue, and it was clear that she was extremely serious. Fang Xingjian also looked at the barbecue in her hands very seriously. A conferred knight's 5 senses were much more sensitive than those of ordinary people. Just by looking at the barbecue and smelling the aroma, he felt that his negative emotions seemed to have improved a lot. A waitress took over the Vulcan barbecue, smiled secretly, and said, "Diana, he's been staring at you for 10 minutes." It was only then that the barbecued young lady, Diana, seemed to have reacted. She lifted her head and saw that Fang Xingjian was staring at her, not even blinking once. A hint of disgust flashed on Diana's face, and she said casually, "Let him be." She had already lowered her head and was once again cooking the barbecue. That waitress said, "He has a knight following him. He should be a young master from some clan, right? Diana, aren't you going to consider it? He's not strong himself, yet he still wants to bring a knight as a follower to swagger through the streets. I'm not interested in a rich second generation like him." Not long later, a large plate of barbecue, which was emitting a great fragrance, was sent to Fang Xingjian. The entire Vulcan barbecue was cut into the shape of a fan into 12 different parts. Using ginseng, pine leaves, soy sauce, fine salt, spices, spicy sauces, and other different seasonings, Fang Xingjian created 12 different flavors of barbecue. Moreover, there was a balance between the fat and lean meat, and the meat quality was even. Fang Xingjian casually picked up a piece and ate it. He felt that the skin was extremely crispy, while the meat was extremely tender and smooth. Waves of fragrance exploded in his mouth. The fat and lean meat were mixed together, displaying an extremely great texture. There was also the fragrance of pine leaves mixed in, faintly reducing the greasy taste of the barbecue. Fang Xingjian was stunned for a moment before saying, "It's very delicious." He threw a glance at Robert and said, "You should try it as well." Robert took a bite, and his brows immediately twitched. The two of them took turns to eat, and in the blink of an eye, they finished the 12-colored Vulcan barbecue. Fang Xingjian exhaled and said, "It's a pity that it's not the meat of ferocious beasts. Otherwise, it would definitely be even more delicious." Robert nodded. To be able to barbecue ordinary pork to such an extent, the taste would definitely be raised to another level if it were to be cooked using the meat of ferocious beasts, which were even more tender and delicious. Therefore, Fang Xingjian said, "Go and ask her if she's willing to be my chef." Robert smiled and nodded. He walked up to Diana, the barbecued young lady, and asked, "Miss, I wonder if you're willing to change your job? We can provide you with double your salary." Diana threw a glance at Robert and Fong Xingjian and said, "I'm the one who opened this shop. I like barbecued meat a lot and have no intention of changing jobs. Please don't come and harass me." Robert was stunned for a moment before saying, "Miss, you might not know our identities." Diana treated Fong Xingjian as an ordinary lascivious person and said, "I don't care what your identity is. Has there ever been a lack of nights in the great western city? Leave after you're done eating. I don't have time to entertain you guys." Robert frowned. Just as he was about to say something, Fong Xingjian said, "Forget it, Robert. There's no need to force it." Fong Xingjian was not a bandit. Moreover, he had just eaten the delicacies, and a large portion of his negative emotions had dissipated. He was in a good mood. A waiter walked over, wearing an unwelcoming expression. "Hello." A total of 100 copper coins. Fong Xingjian got Robert to pay while he took off a golden button from his training clothes, tossed it to Diana, and said, "Miss, I admire your barbecue. If you're willing to change your job, you can bring this button to the regional academy to look for me. If you're not willing, just take it as a tip from me." With that, the two of them left, leaving behind the crowd who were whispering amongst themselves. Chapter 356. A female attendant walked up to Diana, picked up the golden button, took a look, and said, "How stingy. I thought that he's some young master, just because he's following a knight as a follower. He wants to impress our lady boss with just a button?" Another girl took the button and said, "This is gold. Could be made from gold. With this size and this carving, if it were made from gold, it would be worth at least 3 to 5 gold coins. It can't be. Who would be so foolish to use gold to make buttons? That's right. Buttons are worn down every day, and they fall off easily. Wouldn't it be foolish to use gold to make them?" Hearing that it was worth 3 to 5 gold coins, the girls at the side all surrounded them while chattering. 3 to 5 gold coins was a huge sum that they would only be able to save up for 5 to 6 years. Diana frowned slightly and took the button. All right. Stop looking at it. I'm doing business." At the same time, she also felt curious. Could this button really be made from gold? Using gold to make buttons for clothes? That was too extravagant. Just then, another middle-aged lady walked into the shop. "What are you guys talking about? What buttons made from gold? Mother, why are you here again?" Diana shouted. "It's all for you. Do you want to stay here for the rest of your life and roast meat? I think it's quite good to run a restaurant." The middle-aged lady shook her head helplessly and took the button. She said, "This is made from gold? A man gave it to you? Diana, let me tell you, don't be scammed by those ruffians. How can there be buttons made from gold? I think that even though Lewis is a top-notch knight, he wouldn't be so extravagant." "I got it, Mother. You can go back first. I'm doing business." Diana's mother tried to persuade her. "Sigh, what's so good about your business? I think Lewis is quite good. He invited you to a birthday gathering. Why aren't you going?" "Mother, Lewis and I are just good friends. I'm not interested in him." "You?" As she spoke, she put away the gold button. She planned on getting someone to appraise this button in case her daughter was scammed by some Astrostard. On the other hand, Fong Xingjian quickly put the matter to the back of his mind. After eating his fill, he was in a good mood and quickly returned to the sacred land to cultivate again. The compensation of 30,000 gold quickly arrived. Daniel and Gus also brought the geomagnetic essence over. However, Fong Xingjian only accepted the geomagnetic essence and did not meet with them. As for the other messy matters, he paid them no mind. If he had to manage everything, then what would be the point of having Ferdinand, Robert, Anthony, and Zhou Xingwen? His thoughts were already focused on the second level of the mystical prince. He still had to refine the raw materials and then carve the mystical prints on his body. 8 hours passed quickly, and layers of lines spread from his arm to his shoulder blade. They were like countless unknown words, emitting a faint fluorescent light. At the next moment, the fluorescent light disappeared, and Fong Xingjian's mystical prince had already reached the second level. He breathed in slightly and discovered that his efficiency in exchanging information and energy with ether particles had increased once again. The effects of the first level of the mystical prince have increased by 1-fold, while the effects of his second level have increased by 3-folds. If this goes on, will the 10th level be able to increase the effects by 10-folds? Fang Xingjian was astonished as he sensed that his body was continuously exchanging with the ether particles in the outside world. His ether synchronization rate was also increasing at an astonishing rate. He reckoned that before the end of this month, his ether synchronization rate should be able to break through 50%, allowing him to reach second transition level 24. These mystical prints are so amazing that they can even turn a good-for-nothing into a genius. Then, Fang Xingjian's eyes flickered, and he could not help but think. The second prince had already obtained the mystical prince 17 years ago. With his status and wealth, it's impossible for him not to cultivate the mystical prince. He might have already reached the 10th level. With such efficiency, what level has his true abilities reached? Will he really be as inferior to the first prince as he appears to be? Sensing the increase in his aptitude brought about by the mystical prince, Fang Xingjian suddenly felt that the second prince's true abilities were definitely not that simple. However, it was impossible for him to know that he had already successfully cultivated the prodigious demolition sword. Right now, he had the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-range attacks, the prodigious demolition sword for close-range attacks, and the ether sword ripples to assist him from mid-range to long-range attacks. His strategy in sword arts was already very perfect. Thereafter, Fang Xingjian planned on continuing to perfect it. He would continue to synthesize techniques for the Zenith Light Sword formation, the prodigious demolition sword, and the ether sword ripples. This would allow his sword arts abilities to continue to improve. However, this would require even more sword arts. As for the tempering of his other attributes, the improvement of his waves and mental cultivation method, Fang Xingjian had been cultivating his physical body for 24 hours a day. There was no need for him to split his attention. Just then, a strong sense of hunger came from his consciousness. It was the tremors of the heaven's volition sword intent. Hungry again? Fang Xingjian frowned slightly and entered a small portion of the prodigious demolition sword's information. As expected, regardless of whether it's the improvement of my sword arts or the heaven's volition sword intent, I'll have to look for more sword arts. Therefore, an hour later, Fang Xingjian entered the library and started to browse through the sword techniques and killing technique section. He did not open up the books to read, but stood before the bookshelves and used his heaven's perception to scan through the secret manuals. The efficiency of going through them was clearly very fast. Moreover, he had a photographic memory. As long as he scanned through the contents with his heaven's perception, he would be able to memorize them all. It was as if he had moved all the contents regarding killing techniques and sword arts from the library into his brain. After standing before each row of bookshelves for a few hours, Fang Xingjian very quickly stuffed many secret manuals into his brain. He planned to memorize them first and then return to the sacred land to select the killing techniques that were suitable for the Zenith Light Sword formation, ether sword ripples, and the prodigious demolition sword. He would then synthesize them and increase the prowess of these 3 sword techniques. Just then, just as he was scanning through the sword techniques, a cough rang out behind him. Without even turning his head, Fang Xingjian saw through the light ripples that Anderson was standing 20 meters behind him with a provocative expression, looking at him excitedly. Ever since Anderson had gotten 3rd place in the regional selection, he had been holding back and focusing on his cultivation, wanting to defeat Holt and Fang Xingjian. He had been in seclusion for over 2 months and had finally come out today. The moment he came out, he had been searching for traces of Fang Xingjian. When he heard that someone had seen Fang Xingjian in the library, he had immediately chased after him. Right now, Anderson had completed his second transition, turning from a shadow death god to one of the strongest second transition jobs, Death Shadow. After completing the second transition, he had still been in seclusion, only coming out after he had leveled up. This was all so that he could win against Fang Xingjian. Many shadows floated out from his body like fallen leaves. Very soon, they surged out from the ground and the bookshelves in the library, as if turning a large area of the area into darkness. Anderson smiled and said, "This is the Death Shadow's shadow domain. These shadows are alive, and even your light won't be able to change them." Feng Xingjian did not turn and continued to scan through the killing techniques on the bookshelves. Chapter 357. Anderson frowned. The moment he came out from his seclusion, he had been in a hurry to look for Feng Xingjian. He had been training hard for 2 consecutive months, putting in all his effort, all for the sake of defeating Feng Xingjian and erasing the humiliation he had suffered. However, right now, Feng Xingjian did not seem to care about him at all, and this made him extremely infuriated. He shouted, "Feng Xingjian, stop pretending. I know you can hear me. Come and fight with me. I'm going to defeat you and erase the humiliation from my previous loss." Saying this, he stroked his chin and said, "Could it be that you're afraid?" He shrugged. "It's true that my second transition job, the Shadow of Death, is one of the supreme jobs in the second transition. It's also a second transition job that requires the prerequisite job to be the Shadow Death God. It's normal for you to be hesitant. But you can't be thinking that if you don't make a move, I won't dare to make the first move, right?" He let out a maniacal laugh, and at the next moment, he was like a ferocious beast prostrating himself on the ground. His killing intent was like the tip of a blade, brazenly entangling toward Feng Xingjian. On the ground below him, countless shadows seemed to have come to life, twisting and leaping about, exuding waves of deathly aura. "Feng Xingjian, I know that your speed is very fast. The main reason why I chose the Shadow of Death and not the other second transition jobs is because the Shadow of Death is faster. You're the one who taught me this logic. Speed is power. Then you can have a good feel of my speed from now on." As he spoke, the entire floor of the library was covered by shadows, which then extended to Anderson's legs. A librarian shouted, "Stop! The library doesn't allow fighting." However, he had just finished speaking when he felt that there was nothing under his feet, and he had fallen into the shadows. Another 2 level 23 conferred night students stood up, frowned, and said, "Who are you? Fighting isn't allowed here." But Anderson's eyes were still fixed on Feng Xingjian, and there was no one else in his eyes. The shadow under his feet seemed to have become one with his body, like a maglev train that kept pulling and pushing his body. The next moment, Anderson suddenly appeared 1 meter behind Feng Xingjian, then 1 meter to the left and 1 meter to the right. Within the range of the shadow, he could actually move at a high speed as if he was teleporting. The level 23 conferred knight's eyes were filled with astonishment. "That's fast. What technique is this? I can't even see his movements." Anderson laughed out loud. "Feng Xingjian, can you even react at this speed? Is it because you can't get a hold of my figure anymore? Left? Right side? In front? Or at the back? Where should I attack from?" As he spoke, Anderson suddenly appeared at the bottom left of Feng Xingjian with a flash. The dagger in his hand was like a black bolt of lightning, mercilessly piercing toward Feng Xingjian's thigh. At this moment, his explosive speed was over 150 points. In addition to his various specialties, his speed had reached 12 times that of supersonic speed. With a bang, Anderson's fist landed on Feng Xingjian's thigh, but was easily blocked by the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. The dagger in his hand had disappeared without him knowing. Anderson's countenance changed drastically, and with a flash, he retreated 30 meters away. However, he felt his body tighten, and he had already knocked into Feng Xingjian, who had dashed over without him knowing. Feng Xingjian placed his hand before Anderson, and in his palm was Anderson's dagger. Anderson looked at his empty palm, then looked at the dagger in Feng Xingjian's hand. He had no idea when Feng Xingjian had taken away his dagger. He received the dagger from Feng Xingjian in a daze, and then heard Feng Xingjian's voice ringing out. "It's not like it's been a few hundred years. Why would you go into seclusion? You've been in seclusion for 2 months without communicating with the outside world. This means that you're already 2 months behind the most advanced martial techniques in this world. Even if a divine-level expert goes into seclusion, it won't be a seclusion to the point of death. They'll still need to receive new information. Patting Andrewson on the shoulder, Feng Xingjian headed for another row of bookshelves. At this point, Andrewson knew that the difference between him and Feng Xingjian had not been reduced despite him going into seclusion for 2 months. Instead, the difference had become even greater. Andrewson could not help but lift his head and ask, Feng Xingjian, what level are you at? Second transition, level 23. Feng Xingjian turned to look at Andrewson and said, Your strength isn't bad, but you still have a long way to go before you can defeat me. However, I won't accept your challenge every time. If I keep fighting against weaklings, my battle sensitivity will only weaken. Feng Xingjian looked at Andrewson, thinking that other than Zhou Xingwen, Andrewson did not have a single conferred knight under him. This was why he had to personally head to Iron or Town to deal with the counterfeits. It would be good if Andrewson could help him. Andrewson hated people who were more arrogant than him. Looking at Feng Xingjian's attitude, he was so infuriated that his lungs were about to explode. He bellowed furiously, Feng Xingjian, you're just a few steps ahead of me. With my talent, I'll surpass you in 3 months. 3 months is too long. Feng Xingjian looked at Andrewson and smiled, saying, Didn't you say that your death shadow is very fast? It's true that you're able to teleport through shadows. Why don't we make a bet and compare our speeds? Hearing the word bet, Andrewson immediately went on his guard. He still had a lingering fear towards the godly speed that Feng Xingjian had displayed earlier. Feng Xingjian smiled. It's just a competition of speed. I know of a barbecue shop in the great western city. Let's head there from here to buy a set of barbecue meat and see who can return first. How about that? Andrewson's brows furrowed as he pondered. The godly speed that Feng Xingjian had displayed earlier was indeed very fast, but it was not as unbelievable as teleportation. Moreover, the way he had appeared in the shadows was close to teleportation. By then, Andrewson had also understood. He was no longer as astonished as when he had discovered that his dagger had disappeared. Feng Xingjian's speed was not really faster than teleportation. That was impossible. It was just that Feng Xingjian's reaction attribute was above Andrewson's, which was why Feng Xingjian had been able to take advantage of the situation. However, if it was a long-distance movement, the advantage of teleportation would be even more obvious. After understanding all these, Andrewson raised his head once again and asked, Then if I win, you'll have to tell me how you were able to reach second transition level 23 within 2 months. Feng Xingjian nodded in agreement. Then if I win, you'll have to run errands for me for half a year. Andrewson laughed out loud. You want me to run errands for you for half a year? Feng Xingjian, who do you think you are? You're scared? Me? Scared? I'm just scared that you'll go back on your word if you lose. Andrewson once again displayed his extremely arrogant character. He looked at Feng Xingjian and said, How about it? Do you want me to give you a minute's handicap? It's better to be fair. Therefore, Feng Xingjian gave Andrewson the address of the barbecue shop. Andrewson shook the shadow on his hand, shaking out the manager who had been sucked into his shadow earlier. At the next moment, strong gales blew, and both of them disappeared at the same time. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.